today's leading conservative authors. Join us as In Depth welcomes David Horowitz, founder of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and editor-in-chief of FrontPageMag.com. Mr. Horowitz's books include Radical Son, Hating Whitey, and Unholy Alliance. He's most recently the author of Indoctrination U, The Left's War Against Academic Freedom.
Horowitz, who was Betty Van Patter?
Betty Van Patter worked for me at Ramparts. I was in the late 60s and early 70s the editor with Peter Collier of the largest magazine of the left, Ramparts. And I got engaged in helping the Black Panther Party and raised a lot of money to buy a church in East Oakland, which was turned into a school. I called it the Oakland Community Learning Center. And Betty Van Patter was my bookkeeper at Ramparts, and I hired her, I recruited her to do the books for this school. And eventually she was doing the economy, as it were, of the party, the Black Panther Party. In December 1974, Betty Van Patter disappeared. And by the time the police fished her body out of San Francisco Bay 5 weeks later, I had figured out that the Panthers had murdered her. And that was really the end of my career in the left. The murder of Betty Van Patter, the way in which the progressive movement defended the Panthers and covered up their crimes and supported them. The fact that I had to live in fear for many years because the Panthers were, not only were they operative then, but the people, some of the people involved in the murder of Betty Van Patter, or whom I have concluded were involved in the murder, tour American campuses today, get big speaking fees, and continue their attacks on America.
By that time, how long had you been working with the Panthers?
I had been involved for a year or two. I was introduced to Huey Newton by a Hollywood producer. I try to help their community projects is basically what I did.
From your memoir, Radical Son, about that period, you wrote this: "Having Huey's ear made me feel politically powerful in a new way. I had no illusion about the Panthers' role as a revolutionary vanguard. I had become involved with them out of a sense of the exhaustion of the movement and with the idea of doing something of immediate benefit for people in the community. I was tired of pouring energy into grand abstractions like the revolution and longed to see my efforts lead to practical results. However, for the political intellectual like myself, there was a seductive aspect to a partnership with Newton, even in so modest an enterprise that was also grandiose."
Exactly. I mean, the left is, as I also say in this autobiography I wrote, intoxicated with its own virtue. Only the left cares about poor people, only the left cares about black people, only the left is concerned about wars and wants to end them, and pays very little attention to the actual impact of its programs on people. It doesn't weigh the positives versus the negatives. It doesn't see concrete reality. And I watched in the 60s, I was part of the 60s, the movement gin itself up for revolution. And of course the Weather Underground blew up bathrooms in the Pentagon and the Capitol. Which exhausted itself. I mean, the movement actually died around 1969, 1970 because they had escalated their attacks and their posturing to a point where there was nothing more to do unless you were prepared to take up, AK-47s in American cities. And actually, Tom Hayden and others advocated that, but they didn't have any followers. So I said I wanted to do something concrete. Here was a school. Here they had a lot of kids. The Panther Party, maybe there were 100 children, and I wanted to raise money for this and create a school. But looking back, after I realized that the Panthers were murderers, I mean, they were gangsters. They bullwhipped their own members. It was a terrible organization. I had to ask myself after Betty was murdered, if I wanted to do something for real people, why did I go to the Black Panther Party? I could have gone to a local black church and done the same thing. And I came to the conclusion that I did it because the Panthers were going to make a revolution, because of all the grandiose fantasies that drive people on, like me, who are, consider themselves progressives and leftists. And so I got myself involved with murderers, is what happened. And one of the things about this book, Radical Son, I mean, I say in the preface that the people who I really wrote it for, which are young, idealistic progressives like myself, will never read it, and the prediction is proved pretty much true, and that's because the left, which is very, very powerful in the media world, and of course in the universities, has so distorted who I am and what I have to say that these younger generations, particularly if they're in the left, I'm tainted in the way that Whittaker Chambers was. I can remember, one of the things actually I describe in this book is when I eventually became a conservative, which is many, many years after Betty's murder. What the murder of Betty Van Patter did was to stop me and say, you can't go on recruiting people to this cause without understanding what you've done, who they are, and you have to think about this. And I spent about 10 years in which I did no political work. But one of the revelations, Betty disappeared in December '74. I cast my first vote for a Republican in 1984 for Ronald Reagan.
You said you'd voted for Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, but I voted for Jimmy Carter because people came to I remember election day, they say the election's going to be really close. I lived in Berkeley, of course. Election's going to be really close, David. You've got to vote, and I'm operated on that thing that one vote counts, even though, of course, it doesn't. So I had no idea who Jimmy Carter was actually at that point. Because I spent about many years in what I would call a clinical depression after Betty's death, and I really wasn't paying attention to politics. But for the sake of my radical community, which I still was sort of part of, I cast a vote for Jimmy Carter. But it was 1984 that I first voted willfully for a Republican, Ronald Reagan.
You say in your memoir, I'm sorry,
I just want to say the part of this book is the revelation that conservatives weren't the racist, sexist, oppressive devils that the left says. In fact, the conservative community is much richer in its diversity of opinions than the left was. Anyway.
When you write about this movement under your chapter Second Thoughts, you wrote, in truth, neither of us, and I think you're talking about you and your friend Peter Collier, who we'll talk about later, neither of us had systematically thought our way to a conservative position. Our attitude was more a rejection of the postures that we had taken in the past that had proven so empty and destructive.
Right. Exactly. I saw where our left-wing passions, our progressive ideals had led us. One was to lionize and make a central group out of the Black Panthers, an urban street gang that killed a lot of people. SDS had called the Panthers the vanguard of the revolution. I mean, I'm talking about the whole left was behind the Panthers. Another thing we did was to do everything we could to make America lose the war in Vietnam and get out, whatever the consequences. And of course, our opponents, Nixon, said that if we just got out abruptly, there would be a bloodbath. That was the term. And we said, no, the Vietnamese will be liberated and they'll have their own self-determination. What happened was America got out. Of course, we got out not only of Vietnam, but Indochina generally. And 2.5 million people were slaughtered by the communists to make their utopia. So what we had done had led to very bad ends. And I could go on and on. The welfare system, which was, again, something the left advocated and supported, is the worst thing that has been done, the most oppressive institution particularly for black people in this country since slavery. It destroyed the inner city black family, literally. 70% of black children had two parents in the house in 1965. 20 years later, 70% of black children were born out of wedlock. And the statistics show that if you have only one parent in the household, you're 6 times more likely to be poor. So enormous amount of black poverty, black crime, black substance abuse was created by the left. So when Peter Collier and I ceased to be leftists, it was mainly a rejection of these illusions and delusions. And we expected to become part of the American center. And lo and behold, we discovered the center wasn't there. Since we're on a book show, Peter Collier, my books used to be reviewed on the front page of the Sunday Times.
New York Times.
New York Times, which is the publication. Since we voted for Reagan, that has not only ceased to be. I don't even, my books aren't even reviewed in the Times anymore. And that was a price that we paid.
Does this look familiar?
This is the first book I ever wrote.
1962. So
in 1962. I was 23 years old. It's if a book launched, well, I want to aggrandize it that way, it's the first New Left book that anybody wrote. And it's about events in Berkeley. And I kind of backed into it. I had intended to organize 7 or 8 people to write different chapters of the book, and none of them ever did it. So I wound up each time writing the chapter.
Just to give our viewers a flavor, I want to just read a paragraph from it. Actually, this is close to the end. You say, behind every protest over the right to speak is a protest for particular speech. Only those who have something to say in the first place will risk defending the right to say it. Only those who are really concerned with society can be really concerned for freedom. The fight that the students are putting up is just the preliminary struggle. They are young and they are growing up in a world which for them is also young. For this new world, they have new ideas and new methods for putting them into practice. They have, in short, a new politics. The fight now is the fight for freedom to work it out.
Right. I was announcing the arrival of the New Left. That's basically what.
And how do you define the New Left?
Well, the New Left really, in Europe, it began in 1956. It was a reaction to the revelations about Stalin. Of course, they weren't revelations. All the anti-communists were saying that Stalin was slaughtering millions of people, and we were saying that's anti-Soviet propaganda. That's what the old left said. And then the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a famous secret speech, which the Israelis liberated so that it appeared on the front page of the New York Times. It was called the Khrushchev Report. And it was about the crimes of Stalin. Of course, Khrushchev was only concerned about the communists that Stalin killed. He killed a lot of other people as well. So The New Left was an attempt by us. My parents were communists, and all the founders of the New Left came out of the communist left. Our idea was to escape from the taint of Stalinism, and to give us some credit, we didn't want to repeat the mistakes. What happened in the 60s was, after this kind of new beginning, by the end of the 60s, the left was once again supporting communist murderers, whether the Chinese or the Vietnamese communists or the Cambodian communist Pol Pot. So there really can't be a new left. There's only the left, and that's involved. It is and I've come to see it as a crypto religion. It believes that it can create a heaven on earth. And since human beings are really not built psychologically to live in a world where there's no racism, no sexism, no homophobia, no war, no poverty, because these are reflections of who we are, you have to kill a lot of people to bring them in line for your program. And so every Marxist state has been a totalitarian dictatorship and has killed lots and lots of people. And the second half of my life is trying to alert people to that danger.
Tell me more about your parents.
My parents were school teachers. My father came here when he was 1 from Russia after the pogroms that followed the Russian Revolution of 1905, I should say. They were school teachers. They were members of the party. Very decent people in their lives.
Which of them had more influence on you?
Very law-abiding. That is a question I don't even know that I can resolve. My mother had a huge. My mother was the stronger parent in the family, and encouraged me. Probably, it's probably responsible for the grandiose dreams. It was Freud who said that a son secure in his mother's love is a world conqueror forever. Whatever. But as anybody who's read Radical Son will know, there's a huge dialogue with my father. My father was very depressed, very negative person. And a lot of my life struggle, the way I see it, was not to be defeated the way he was.
What happened to him as a teacher?
My father was a member of the Communist Party, and this was in the McCarthy era. And the Communist Party was an international conspiracy. It was orchestrated from Moscow. All the things that the anti-communists said pretty much were true. But my father was just a teacher. And New York had a law called the Feinberg Law, which said you couldn't be a member of the Communist Party and teach. And he refused to answer when he was asked whether he was a member of the Communist Party, because he would have had to say he was, and then he couldn't teach. And by not saying that he was, he also couldn't teach. The history of this, that is vanished because the left writes the history and is teaching it in the schools, is that the reason that my father couldn't get away with lying or just not answering is because there was a woman named Bella Dodd who was a devout Catholic and a devout communist and was the party's liaison with the state legislature. She was very important. And the party told her she had to give up her Catholicism, and she didn't want to do that. So they had a trial of her. I mean, these are the shadow trials that took place during the McCarthy era, and purged her from the party and said terrible things about her. And for her revenge, she revealed the names of people like my father, all the party people. That is a really interesting story that can't be done in a Hollywood that has run, I don't know, whether it's 5 or 10 films taking the communist point of view in the McCarthy era. There's an interesting point of view that's neither the communist point of view nor the McCarthy committee point of view, but it has yet to be dramatized.
What would have been some of the experiences for you as a young boy that would have cemented the communist in you?
Well, in Radical Son, I describe it almost as a process of osmosis. I mean, I went to a summer camp run by the Communist Party. My hero was Paul Robeson or Howard Fast. I went to these meetings where there were these fiery speeches. I had in my life, I mean, I followed the cases of the Martinsville 7 or the Willie McGee, the Scottsboro Boys, all the, these were all cases against blacks who were accused, whether falsely or not, of crimes. In some cases the crime was committed, but Willie McGee, it was executed for rape. No white person was executed for rape then. So my life was filled from the time I was very young with championing causes that appeared to be championing black people in particular, poor people, and so forth. So every experience I had, when the Rosenbergs were executed, it was a horrifying experience for me. I was there on 17th Street with whatever it was, 10,000 people when they were sent to the
How old were you?
Electric chair.
About.
I would have been 14, and I will never forget the wail when you have 10,000 people and you hear these wails. But of course, the Rosenbergs were guilty. So my formative experiences was inside the mythology of the progressive movement.
Now, throughout your life, you have written a lot of books about policy and your thoughts on politics, but you have also co-written 3 huge biographies, family biographies. One on the Rockefellers in 1976, one on the Kennedys in 85, and one on the Fords in 87. How does this fit in?
Well, and I've written 2 autobiographical, actually 3 if you include Uncivil Wars, autobiographical books. Peter Collier was my co-editor at Ramparts, and he was, Peter's a literary person. The Forsyth Saga was was the first big miniseries, which was novels by John Galsworthy. And Peter got this idea to do a generational biography of a great American family, modeled on that. And I had written a famous memo at Ramparts about the Rockefellers. I mean, I was a very studious Marxist, and I had done one of these, it's the power structure and how they control this and that. So I think Peter felt that I would be complimentary. I would provide knowledge that he needed. In the course of that book and the others that I've written with him, I learned how to write. I learned how to do narrative. I had been very theoretical, and so I enjoy it. I put it to use in doing my own autobiography, my own biography.
I want to ask you about a couple things
Sure.
about the Kennedy biography, because you mentioned a very famous historian in here and your interaction with her, or maybe it was her husband, Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Yeah.
What happened between you and Doris Kearns Goodwin's husband in writing this book?
Well, I don't remember the exact detail, but Doris is a really nice person, and I had been to see her and interview her, and but I got a midnight phone call at one point because we were doing competing books on the Kennedys, and in this business, when you're, the goal is to be a bestseller, so that you have to be there first. It doesn't matter whether you've written a better book. If you're not there first, you're not going to get the audience. So he called me, and well, it's an unpleasant sort of little story. Anyway, he wanted me to stop doing the Kennedy book, or he said, or I'll have to write Doris's book, something ridiculous like that.
You'd have to write Doris's book?
Yeah, that was it. I'll have to give up. He was writing some play on. It was a bizarre phone call. But not one of the high points of the book. It was just a little anecdote. But
you also just talk about the fact that you had difficulties with access in writing the Kennedy book that she would not have had.
Oh, a huge. You know, let me just say about the Kennedy book. It's been very gratifying to get. I believe we got a letter from Evan Thomas, who knew Jack Kennedy, and who said, "This is the Jack Kennedy I knew," because neither Peter nor I had ever met Jack Kennedy. These are not political books. The most political one is the Rockefellers, and it's marred by our sort of new left politics at the end. We didn't do justice to Nelson Rockefeller because of our politics. But these other books, the one we did on the Kennedys, we did another one on the Fords, are not political books. They're biographies. This Ford book is probably the best, although the Kennedy is really, people love that book as a read.
You went after the Kennedy book, and I don't...
Oh, but you asked me about the Kennedys, yeah, of all the books we did, the Rockefellers led us into their archive. The Kennedys were the hardest. People were afraid, this is their close friends, were afraid of being, you know, cut off from the Sun King, from the light. And so they were incredibly nervous about being interviewed at all. They had to get permission. They had to get, it was just very, very difficult to piece together the story. Although in the end, if you're persistent enough, you can get the story.
You tell the story.
Whereas the Fords, now this is American capitalism. This was the Ford Motor Company. They let us into the archives. They Xeroxed their, they even let me read, you know, the minutes of their executive committee of the motor company. They did the Xeroxing at their cost for us, although it was not an official biography. And Henry Ford did not want to be interviewed to the very end of the book. But then when I interviewed people, unlike with the Kennedys, where there was this social thing, where people did not want to be disinvited to the parties, so they wouldn't talk. With the Ford Motor Company, you had all these executives who had worked their way up from, you know, I was very impressed with the number of people who came from, you know, working class or middle class backgrounds who became top Ford executives. And so they were multi-millionaires. They could care less about what anybody thought, and they talked to us. So it was a very different experience.
Why did you make, and I think you used the word deal, with Bobby Kennedy Jr., that you would not write about the family's drug use that had not been written about before?
Yeah, I wrote that well, you have to get access some way. And what I said to Bobby Kennedy, because this is Bobby Jr. This was a generational story. And I will tell your story. I can't not talk about drug use that's been, because they were doing drugs all the time. I mean, I couldn't be close to them without seeing the drug use. So I had to somehow, so I made that deal. I said, I'm not going to write anything that hasn't been in the papers about, and he was particularly concerned about David Kennedy's drug use. And I kept my word on that. I didn't publish anything, but we found out an awful lot.
You, in the most recent years, have been working on a couple projects. Let's talk about the most recent one first before we go to some phone calls.
Really, if you look at, yes, I've been doing these books. One is called The Professors, and the other is called Indoctrination U. And I'm just finishing another one, and probably will do one more. And, you know, this sort of just happened, but when I look over my writing career, I can see, I mean, it's a theme from the beginning. The first book I wrote was about universities. My book on reparations, my reparations campaign, Uncivil Wars, which is at the bottom of this pile,
Thank you.
the very bottom, is really about the universities. It's about what happened when I tried to place an ad, which was really, you know, an ad that was meant to stimulate a discussion about whether reparations should be paid for slavery 137 years after the fact, and paid to people who never were slaves, and paid by people who were not slave owners or not even, their ancestors weren't even in the country when there was slavery. I just, you know, try to start a discussion. And
This is just 5 years ago.
yeah, but that's the beginning of my academic, and what I realized, I mean, I submitted an ad called 10 Reasons Why Reparations Are a Bad Idea and Racist as well. And I submitted it to 71 college papers, and 43 rejected the ad. And they rejected it because of its contents. And then when I attempted to speak on campus, I went to the University of California, Berkeley, which is my one of my alma maters. I was a grad student there. The chancellor, I asked the chancellor to introduce me because I said, I know your campus is out of control, and for the safety of the students, you should be there or somebody from your office. He accused me of provoking a dialogue no one wanted to hear. Now this is an educator. And then he assigned 30 armed police for that event. Well, it was a disgrace. I mean, and I suddenly saw that on our campuses there are issues that you can't discuss, that people will shout you down. It just happened to Columbia recently with the Minutemen, that you cannot discuss the borders issue in a university. What does that say about the university? And what does it say about the administrators that they don't expel students who obstruct speeches like that? I mean, if you don't have the decorum to have a civilized intellectual discussion, where else in America can you do that? Everywhere else, you know, it's a political food fight. So that began me, that experience with the reparations began me on a course. I devised an academic Bill of Rights, which is just a basic liberal document. It just says there should be two sides when there's a controversial issue, and that speaker shouldn't be obstructed. That's one of its principles. And I was viciously attacked by the American Association of University Professors and other academics who called me a McCarthyite, said it was Orwellian, and presented it as trying to regulate professors, which is ridiculous. I mean, professors sign contracts in which one of the presumptions is they're going to follow scientific method and they're going to be professional and not indoctrinate students. They're going to teach them, which means presenting them when you have a controversial matter with more than one side. So I found myself, I thought this would be a pretty brief campaign. This has been 4 years now that I've been doing this. And this book, Indoctrination U, is about the attacks on the Academic Freedom Campaign. And the professors? And I'm sad to say that recently, just this last month, the American Association of University Professors has turned its back on a 100-year history of defending academic freedom and is now defending indoctrination in the classroom. It says if an academic discipline says it's true, then it's true. And in particular, they're defending women's studies, because the women's studies departments, and I've studied a lot of them across the country, presume that gender is socially constructed, which means that environment determines the characteristics, male and female. Now, this is to put the best foot on this point of view. I mean, you could say, well, this is a point of view that you can argue, and professors have a right to argue the point of view. But it is a contested one. Neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, biology, all have shown that there are genetic and biological bases for some of the male-female differences. And Steven Pinker has written quite a famous book called The Blank Slate, which discusses these. But what the American Association of University Professors is saying is it's all right for women's studies departments to teach a very controversial view as though it were the truth in a classroom, if they say it's the truth. Well, that means that, for example, intelligent design is a point of view about evolution. If the intelligent design people establish a department at a university, they can teach intelligent design to students and tell them that this is the truth and give them grades based on how much they appreciate the truth. Or, you know, we can extend that, and maybe we get a department of conservatism somewhere, or you know, you just could go on and on. If some racists establish a department and say, you know, racial inequalities are genetically based, and this race is genetically inferior, they can teach it as though it were the truth by what the AAP says. So this is, to me, one of the most important battles that this country faces.
You chose 101 professors across the country and called them the most dangerous academics.
No, my publisher called them the most dangerous, but I have to live with that. Authors do not, I mean, titles are a marketing device, and therefore a publishing company, when they insist on it, they do. There's about, I think it's I can't remember if it's 13 or 15,000 or 17,000 word essay in that book, which explains what it's about. I don't even use the word dangerous in the 113,000 word text. What this is a portrait of professors who are political activists, not scholars, or who believe that political activism and scholarship is one and the same. Now, a scholar, an academic, the word academic means that you kind of suspend, you don't prejudge conclusions. When you say something's academic, it means it's debatable. That's a kind of use of the word. So we expect scholars and teachers in universities to have a certain disinterest and dispassion when they approach a subject. I went through my entire university career without ever hearing a professor express a political view in a classroom. I would warrant
even at Berkeley.
Even at Berkeley. Even at Berkeley. I would warrant there are no classrooms that are free from that now. I remember my professors would always, be in a devil's advocate position. They were teaching us how to think. It's authoritarian societies that teach you what to think in a classroom. And I have, that is a portrait of 101 professors, and I estimate there are 60,000 like them, and I give the reason in the book, who confuse politics with teaching and with scholarship. And they want their students to reach conclusions on controversial subjects that they share, and they indoctrinate them. And that book created a storm probably as big as the reparations controversy. Even really
bigger,
shouldn't have.
Even bigger than Unholy Alliance?
Yeah, Unholy Alliance probably should have caused the storm, but didn't.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because I want to invite our viewers so that they can get queued up to ask you questions. David Horowitz is our guest on In Depth this month, and here's how you can join in on our conversation. For Republicans, 202-737-0001. For Democrats, 202-737-0002. We have a line for independents, 202-628-0205. And because of the issue that we have just been talking about, we have an extra line this month, and it is for professors and students who would like to talk about that issue that we've been talking about, 202-628-0184. We'll also take a lot of emails during this 3-hour program, and the email is booktv@cspan.org. Back to Unholy Alliance.
Unholy Alliance really comes out of my life experience with the left. The book sets up the problem the book attempts to solve, or the puzzle is. the radical Islamicists, the Islamo-fascists, if you will, are obviously anti-women, anti-gay, religious fundamentalists, and medievalists. I mean, they want to go back to a religion as it was set down in the 7th century. Yet, there is an alliance of convenience, if it were, yet you see progressives who claim to be motivated primarily by defense of women, of gays, human equality. Of course, Islam is a hierarchical religion with people outside, the infidels not counting for anything. How can people who claim to be progressive get out there and try to keep in power Saddam Hussein or try to stop America from attempting to create democracy in Iraq? How can they, on campuses, if you look at the left-wing demonstrations against the war, you'll see that the Muslim Students Association is part of their steering committee. A Muslim Students Association is created by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is part of the jihad, the Islamic jihad against the West, and they are totalitarians. And everything that the left claims to be against. So how do you explain this? And that book is an attempt to explain this. And so the center of the book, the long center of the book, is called the Mind of the Left, something like that. And what I explain is that what forges this alliance is that the left is as I said, I think earlier, it's a form of religion. The left is it's the Pelagian heresy in Catholic history. Pelagians believed that human beings could create the kingdom of God on earth. Liberation theology is a form of this. That by human agency you can create a world in which there's equality and no wars and no poverty and so forth and so on. Who stands in the way of this? Well, of course, it's the United States. The left no longer really seriously planned, well, never really did, for its kingdom of heaven on earth. There's no real plan of how to replace, say, the market system with something that would work better. It is a fantasy. It's a utopian dream. So what the left is focused on really is the other side of any revolution, which is the work of destruction. It's a nihilistic formation, the left. Its entire intellectual energy is focused on attacks on America, because America is the capitalist power that defends all the others. So the left and the Islamicists have a similar view of America. It's the great Satan. The Islamicists call it the near enemy is the Mubarak regime, the regime in Saudi Arabia. And the far enemy is the United States. And they began by attacking the near enemy, but they decided that they can't take down the near enemy without taking down the United States. So that's the great Satan. And American leftists are totally sympathetic to this cause, taking down the United States.
Just wondering, 2004, I think? Let me just double check. Yes, 2004 this was published. We go to the phones. Brooklyn, New York, your first up.
I don't even know where to begin. But, when you keep repeating lies, I guess you really believe it's the truth. So let me start with some of your friends on the right. John Hagee, a minister on TV, who has the audacity to say that Christians flew the planes into the World Trade Center, and his whole seminary over there stands up and claps and cheers. That's anti-American. your other friends on some of the other channels, these televangelists, who say that Democrats are the equivalent to Palestinians. Back to John Hagee, who says it's okay to be anti-Semitic. So don't tell me about Democrats. You, and I've seen what you do, you started a whole thing with Harvard, and you got the dean of Harvard fired. But you didn't have the manliness to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, I started to do one thing and it backfired. You all should go to Iran because that's the type of country that you want.
Brooklyn?
This lady lives on another planet. I can't tell you how many times people from the far left begin by saying, I don't know where to begin. And then if you'll notice, and then call me a liar, and then don't speak to one specific, not one single specific thing that I said. It's hard to answer if people don't talk to what you're saying. I've never met John Hagee. I have no idea whether what this woman's saying is true or not. I seriously doubt it. I don't ever remember getting anybody fired at a university or calling for it, and certainly not a dean of Harvard. I think she's referring to Larry Summers. Mm-hmm. I'm a big defender of Larry Summers because Larry Summers, the forced resignation of Larry Summers symbolizes what's happened to our universities, the terrible intellectual debasement of our universities by the academic left. He was a man who, in a closed meeting, first of all, he was the most powerful university president in the history of the modern university, bar none. But he was forced to resign within 4 years because he crossed the left, and the final issue was his suggestion that women and men may have different aptitude for mathematics, which is pretty much a scientifically established fact. But this, one of the women, there were only 12 people in the room, it was closed, nobody would have ever heard of this, but one of the feminists there slammed her computer shut, stormed out of the room, went right to the press, and said that Larry said she wanted to throw up, and that Larry Summers was undermining the esteem of little girls. By what? Talking about a scientific fact. I mean, it's a scientific fact that, I don't know, Asians have a higher IQs than Caucasians like me. Do I slam my computer shut when somebody says that? Does that lower my self-esteem? No. So here we have anti-intellectual professors. There was also a university chancellor there who subsequently committed suicide. Denise Denton was part of this crew. These people have no business being in a university if that's their attitude towards intellectual knowledge. But the fact is that Larry Summers was forced to resign. He was replaced by a feminist. We'll see what she does. But anyway, this woman has that all wrong. I'm sure she has whatever she said about Hagee wrong, but I don't know the man.
San Diego, hello.
Yes, David, you're a hero of mine, like Orwell and Christopher Hitchens, who defends him and gives us his significance for the present-day political struggle. I saw you at Arizona State University when you brought up redemptist philosophies and how dangerous they are. I believe you were just referring to that in reference to the utopian liberation movements that pollute our politics today. And I would like you to help me understand that, and also to relate it to today's political leaders, especially on the left, and how they're using political correctness, environmental movements, various liberation movements, to impose very subtly their philosophy on the United States. And I might mention Hillary Clinton was a lawyer for the Black Panthers also.
Thanks, San Diego.
Well, actually, Hillary was a law student who worked for the defense team in the New Haven trial of the Panthers, where These Panthers who were on trial had participated in the torturing of a young black Panther named Alex Rackley and his murder. And the entire left went out, this was in 1971, they shut down Yale University. And the president of Yale made this disgraceful remark that a black revolutionary, meaning Bobby Seale, couldn't get a fair trial in America. That's why they tried to shut down the trial. But Alex Rackley was tortured in the Black Panther office by these Panthers and murdered. That's a very sad chapter. Redemption. Unlike my friend Christopher Hitchens, who thinks that religion is the problem, I think it's we who are the problem. If religion is man-made, as Christopher says, then any defect of religion is you attribute to human beings, not to God, obviously. I don't believe that people, and I mean this in the broad sense, there are individuals, who can escape this, but that people generally need a hope. I mean, we are going to, all of us, I don't want to depress people on this Sunday, but we're all going to die, and there will be no memory of us. As time goes on, everything that we do, everything that was important for us will be erased. This is a very hard existential fact for people to cope with. And so we all live inside stories where things are meaningful. And it's important what your batting average is, records, we have halls of fame, and so forth. But we also have these religious fervors. We believe that there is going to be some kind of a redemption, that somehow this meaninglessness that we all inhabit is going to be made sense of. So there is only religion. But in my view, there are two kinds of religion. One kind of religion is that this life is what it is, and that the redemption, if there is a redemption, will take place when we're dead, through a divinity. People who have that view are basically conservative. And in my view are not the problem. And this is not really just right and left, because there are people on the right who think we can have a world without abortions. No, we can't. As long as there are human beings, there will be abortions. You can try to persuade people not to have abortions, but you can't make laws that will end abortion. It will not happen. They confuse again politics with religion. What's possible in this world with what's desirable. Secular redemptionists, if I can put it that way, although there are liberation theologians, theologies as well, the other kind of religion believes that you can have it on this earth, that we can actually have a future which is progressive, that we can change fundamentally the way we live. And this idea is the most dangerous idea in the world. This is what motivates people to blow up the World Trade Center. This is what motivated progressives like Lenin and Stalin and Mao and Ho and Fidel Castro to kill over 100 million people, pretty much in my lifetime. The idea that you can make the world a better place with a capital B and a capital P, this is the danger, and the caller is right. There are people in the environmental movement on the extremer ends of it, where I would include our former vice president, who believe that human beings, we can alter the world's climate, save the world, and so forth. No. The effort to do that, because it's justified by such spectacular ends, if you believe that you can end poverty, war, racism, forever. What crime will you not commit? What lie will you not tell? And that's why progressives have committed such horrendous atrocities and told such big lies in the 20th and now the 21st century.
Lexington Park, Maryland. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Horowitz, good afternoon. Good to talk to you. I've had a couple of kids through public education and have been depressed with the quality of the education that my daughters received. And I've seen this erosion project itself into the universities. I've read a couple of your books. And I was wondering, I haven't seen any studies on the comparison of American universities and international, other industrialized countries' universities. And I was wondering if you had any information in that area.
Well, no, I don't. But there are such studies, and we're way behind. One of the, the vexed problems over immigration is that we desperately need high-tech people from other parts of the world because American kids are not doing the hard sciences and the engineering and the mathematics that's necessary for us to compete in the modern world. And all too much time is being taken up these days with political exercises or ideological exercises. I've had several children go through schools recently, and grandchildren. It's all too much multicultural nonsense where students will find out, know more about the Nile Valley than they do about the American Constitution or the free market system. And this is not healthy.
Actually, one of our emailers, Twana Blevins, asked you to be specific on that. She wants to know what are some of the good colleges that you would recommend?
Well, colleges, universities are very large institutions. So if you go to a large university, there are many places in that university that are unaffected by the politicization of the university and their abuse by left-wing academics. And I really, I want to be careful here. There are a lot of good scholars who have left-wing views. This is not about having a left-wing point of view on some subject. It's about your attitude or their attitude towards scholarship itself. I visited Kenyon College, which is a small liberal arts college. It's usually what I warn people against, and it's in a remote area, so there's a whole culture that grows up around it. But I found when I was at Kenyon that they had a very traditional curriculum. They don't have they don't have women's studies or black studies. I asked the students, when they teach you Shakespeare, do they teach the literature or do they use it as a pretext for teaching you about imperialism or sexism? And the students said they teach literature. So I've never taken a course at Kenyon, but I think it's probably a good school. But I think you can find at most universities good teachers, whatever their political persuasions. You just have to ask around. You have to talk to other students to find out which teachers are using their classroom for their political agendas and which teachers are teaching.
New York.
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Horowitz.
Hey.
I have a comment and a question, and this is probably going to shock you because I consider myself a democratic socialist, but I'm going to be in agreement with you about a bunch of things. I think U.S. institutions are set up using a classic like Enlightenment and liberal sort of discourse, like focusing on Aristotle and Kant. And what essentially happens is that everything after, Kant and Nietzsche has been forgotten. It hasn't even been looked at. And this sort of goes to the point made previously about what impact does this have on American institutions compared to international institutions. And I can't tell you how many times I have met people that want to study postmodern discourse, that want to study, that are physicists and want to critique Newtonian discourse in physics. And they can't do it in American institutions. I'll give you a personal case. I wanted to go to law school, and I wanted to study postmodern legal theory. I wanted to critique, our legal system, and I can't do it at any American legal institution. If I wanted to do something like that, I would have to go to Europe. If I wanted to critique Newtonian physics, I would have to go to Europe. And the problem with your criticism is that you only talk about the marginalization of people on the right, but you don't talk about the marginalization of people on the left, people like Slavoj Žižek, David Harvey, Pierre Schlag. Why don't you do that?
Well, first of all, let me say that some of my best friends think that they're democratic socialists, although I regard it as an oxymoron or contradiction in terms. I have no idea what this caller is talking about because critical legal studies is a form of postmodern criticism of the American legal system, which is a powerful school of thought at Harvard and almost every university. Critical race studies, which is a form of what I would call racial extremism, and a combination of that and Marxism is taught at every major university. The critique of Newtonian physics. I mean, Einstein was a critic of Newtonian physics, but I just don't think that he's living in the real world here. I don't, I'm pretty familiar with left-wing writers. I think, Cornel West would be surprised to hear that leftists are marginalized. There are an awful lot of leftists pulling down $200,000 and $300,000 salaries at American universities who are, with 20 honorary degrees or more. There are, I don't know any conservatives in that category.
This emailer asked the question, or first makes a statement, exposing the fact that the teaching of Middle East studies at our university is very skewed and one-sided, is the best possible first step to changing the situation. What do you believe is the next step?
What the first step is recognizing?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's mildly put. The Middle Eastern studies profession is generally on the other side of the war on terror. It's much more serious than that. Columbia has a disgraceful Middle Eastern Studies department filled with anti-Semites and America haters who abuse their students. I was just reading an article by a Columbia professor named Joseph Massad, who was abusive of his students, who wrote an article in 2002 that homosexuals don't exist in the Arab world, and that it's the gay international is responsible for creating the illusion that they do and that they're oppressed. And this is a terrible, this is a professor of Middle Eastern Studies. 4,000, we know of 4,000 gays who've been executed in Iran for being gay. What the next step is, recognizing this fact, that our Middle Eastern Studies departments are greenhouses of apologies for terrorists. It's very difficult to know what to do, because the universities are set up, they're feudal institutions. Professors, when they're tenured, have lifetime jobs. There are no standards that are enforced. I've spent many, many hours trying to get one institution, Penn State, to ask a professor when she is assigning books on the subject of poverty, and not to assign just 2 left-wing books, but to give the students an array, a diversity of thought. Why would a major university like Penn State deny students texts in a course that reflect a different view of poverty than Barbara Ehrenreich's? To me, this is a primitive argument that I'm attempting to have with these administrators. But I can't get the faculty there. I can't get, I'm still in the process. But this is just one example that I could give.
Some states have accepted your declaration of...
No.
No?
I devised an academic Bill of Rights. I took it to a university where I happen to know the chairman of the regents. It happened to be the SUNY system in New York, which has 69 campuses and 400,000 students. And he was unable just unable. He agreed with the Academic Bill of Rights to put it in place. Nobody would have written about it. It would have just disappeared. And the minute I saw that, I said, I'm going to go to legislatures and ask them for resolutions. I have never asked for a law. All I've asked is for a sense of the legislature, because I know that if the legislature says that, 85% of our students are in state-funded schools. Since I'm asking for a principle that is endorsed, paid lip service to by every administration in the country. You go to any university administration, they'll tell you they're for academic freedom, they'll tell you you sit with the president, yes, students should hear both sides of controversial issues, they shouldn't be force-fed one side. No disagreement, but there would be nothing. But by going to legislatures, I aroused the American Association of University Professors and the American Federation of Teachers to call me names. And suddenly this became a story, and now it's been covered in press across the country, and every administrator in the country has discussed the Academic Bill of Rights. Sure, in Colorado, there was a joint resolution by both houses of the legislature endorsing basically the Academic Bill of Rights, but the legislature is controlled by Democrats, and that means absolutely nothing is being done. Nothing. Here we have a case at Penn State where Penn State has a wonderful academic freedom provision. It says it's not the function of a teacher in a democracy to indoctrinate his or her students, and therefore the teacher is obligated to provide them access to materials on more than one side of a controversial issue, and to present the divergent opinions of others in a fair-minded way. The teacher's obligated. And when I take this Penn State regulation to the Penn State administration, they say talk to the deans, the faculty deans. So, and I talk to the faculty dean. I have a letter from the dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Susan Welch, at Penn State, who says, I've read your letter, and it's just about, these two books. How about a third book? It's a big problem. It says, I've read your letter and considered your arguments, and I see no further point in discussion. Just slam the door. With a university system set up like this, as I say, administrators look at what happened to Larry Summers at Harvard, the most powerful university president in the history of the university. He was challenged by anti-intellectual, and I would say totalitarian feminist faculty. 10% of the Harvard faculty voted to censure him, and he was finished. So what university administrator is going to take on their faculty, which is dominated by these political leftists? The vast majority of professors are decent scholars. The principals I've said, they will provide students with a range of opinions. They will not try to indoctrinate them. I say this, the vast majority. But there's 10% of every faculty, and they're the ones who control the faculty senate. They control the teacher unions and the AAUP guild. They're the ones who write the op-ed pieces. Why? Because they're very political people. They like politics. Real scholars, they don't want to be bothered with departmental politics. They don't want to be the chairman of the department. They don't want to be on the search committees. They want to do their scholarly work. So we have a big problem, and I actually don't want to leave this by saying you can do nothing. People have to wake up. People have to get active at the university level. Keep complaining. Keep pointing this out. Students need to file grievances when their teachers use the classroom for political platforms, when they're being denied text. And when the people speak in a democracy, actually you do get results.
Miami, hello.
Hi, Mr. Horowitz.
Hey.
Let me begin by saying that I'm not a communist or really a leftist in any sense. I'm actually the son of Cuban immigrants, and I'm really disgusted by the liberals' attitude towards the Castro regime, and basically just manifestations of Marxism, throughout history. I mean, it obviously hasn't worked. But that being said, I do sort of admire the tidiness of Marxist doctrine in the sense that it kind of gives you a very clearly defined goal. And, I think that whenever you set out to sort of devise a plan for a society, you should be a utopian thinker. And, my problem with people on the right is that you all sort of don't really have a very clearly defined goal. You're sort of content to leave us at the mercy of market forces or corporate forces. And really my question to you is, how much of a role, in your view, how much of a role should government play? Should government play any role whatsoever in the lives of people? And, isn't the increasing privatization that we've seen, which the Bush administration has taken to the next level, isn't that really bad for the country because we don't have oversight and, we're just kind of at the mercy of corporations, which are only interested in the bottom line?
Okay. Let me just say, you throw out so many huge questions, but the first thing I want to say is, yes, Marxism is neat, and it is the salvation of mediocrities and mediocre minds. And one of the reasons that feminism, this radical form of feminism, you have these race, gender, class, hierarchy nonsense, as such a big fashion in the universities, is that people, unimaginative people, who are intellectually not up to the challenge of dealing with the messiness of creation, fall back on these formulas, the feminist formulas. It's socially constructed. You don't have to think. You just plug in the formula. On this, I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking utopianly. I think there's a problem with acting in behalf of a utopia. The word utopia, as you know, means nowhere. And it's nowhere because it's impossible to achieve. And attempting to achieve the impossible is what gets so many people killed. I can't answer in brief question about the mixed economy, but let me take this opportunity. Since I'm on this show, I've been given this rare opportunity by C-SPAN to point out at C-SPAN in the universe of media is the only medium that nobody complains about. When leftists turn on C-SPAN, they can see leftists. When conservatives turn it on, they see conservatives. It manages in this tremendous array spectrum we have of formal, Democratic Party, Republican Party politics, of left-wing radical politics, of right-wing radical politics, to be fair and balanced. And it's the only medium that is. Now, C-SPAN was created by private companies. It was created by the cable companies. And the architect of C-SPAN, Brian Lamb, was a Nixon administration official who actually was sent on a mission by Nixon to try to bring PBS and public television in line, because public television was created by the Democratic Party to attack the Nixon administration. That's why and how it was created. And I actually have written a book called Public Television and the Public Interest, or Public Broadcasting and the Public Interest. But so it's my view that only conservatives are capable of fairness and balance in this way. And not that there aren't fair-minded people on the left. There probably are. But to create an institution, I don't know of any liberal institution that's fair to conservatives. As I say, I used to be front page of the New York Times, and now I can't buy a review there. To be totally fair, in the last 10 years, Unholy Alliance was reviewed in a very dismissive way, calling me a relic because I used the word neo-communist in the book and described this left. But without dealing, I offer this book to anybody who wants to read it and take a look and see. I was very careful to show that the critique of America by the left, whether it's obsessional America haters like Noam Chomsky, or much more rational leftists like Todd Gitlin, share such an extreme view of America that it's indistinguishable from the views that you would have read 40 or 50 years ago in the Communist Party newspaper.
Della Vista, Arkansas.
Oh, hi. David, you're old enough to know better. I just don't get it.
I wish they had flashed on the screen for me which is the Democratic caller, which is the...
I'm sorry, I can tell you that this is a Democrat.
So I can tell you that. So I would know in advance. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead.
You don't know. That's the whole story. I don't know how old you are, but I'm 59, and you look as old as me.
Yeah, I got 10.
Let me tell you something. I'm a Vietnam veteran who's voted Democrat his whole life and loves his country and is not a leftist. I don't even know what a leftist is. You're using the word leftist like it can actually describe a human being. You know, rightists can't describe you. Some of the things you said I agree with totally. And you just keep saying leftist. When people are curious about what's wrong and they look into things, you're calling them leftist. It just doesn't make any sense for a man your age.
Well, you called yourself a Democrat. Is Democrat defined? I mean, there was Maxine Waters is a Democrat. Joe Lieberman was a Democrat till I kind of purged him from the party.
Does leftist mean the same thing now that it did in the 60s?
Yeah, I've written a whole book about this. I don't know if you have a copy. It's called The Politics of Bad Faith.
Yes, I do.
And it's why the terms left and right are appropriate. Yeah, there it is.
9 years ago.
That's kind of the intellectual companion to Radical Son, and explains why I think these categories are applicable. Of course, no category can adequately describe any human being, probably. But in order to have a discourse about anything, you have to use categories. I've sprinkled in the word progressive. I've never said that all Democrats are leftist. And I think I also said in the course of this program that there were leftist professors who were fair and reasonable. And, you know, there's no matter how many times I qualify the word left, I'm always going to get a criticism like this. If you send your name into C-SPAN, I'll be happy to send you that book and explain to you what the difference between left and right is. But it goes back in a way to an earlier part of this discussion where I was talking about two kinds of religion. Of one which says this world has basically got limits to it. Basically, there are limits to what human beings can ever accomplish. And one that says the sky's the limit. Conservatives, people on the right, not on the extreme right, who are a type of religionist that thinks they can change this world. But conservatives generally believe that the root cause of all social problems is us, individuals. It's the way we're built. And therefore a conservative gets up in the morning and is happy if the world isn't worse today than it was yesterday. Because that has a sense, or she has a sense of inbuilt limits. Leftists, and this is a very loose definition, but leftists believe that the root cause of social problems is social institutions. And that if you change the social institutions, you will change people. That's what the theory of social construction is about. But change social institutions and you'll change people. Obviously, there's grains of truth in every position that lots of people hold. And you can alter some things by altering some social institutions. But you can't change who people are and the way they interact and the fact that they're at each other's throats and that we're always that far from barbarism. And that when there isn't a law, when you don't have a police force around and laws to back them up, you're going to have an orgy of criminality. We don't behave unless we're watched. Does that mean that everybody has to be watched? No, it doesn't. Our society functions because most people are law-abiding. But if you take away the law, if we didn't have a police in this country and we didn't have a legal system, we'd be back in the Stone Age. The strong would stomp all over the weak. Women would be raped in the streets. It's just the unfortunate human reality. So it's all a matter of degrees. There's a spectrum. And my hat's off to you if you served your country in Vietnam. And I believe, what you're telling me. But you have to, decide whether you're going to be part of the spectrum of the left, which believes that by changing social institutions you can change human nature, or of the right, which believes that we start with human nature and we have limited expectations of what we can do politically.
New York, hello.
Hello?
You're on the air.
Okay. New York, hello.
Ma'am, you have to turn your television set all the way down.
Hello? Yes. The question for David Horowitz is, well, I am astounded that you profess concern for people's rights, and especially on this program for the situation of gays and women, when you are sending as speakers and spokespeople for your, as you call it, the Islamofascism Awareness Week, speakers such as Rick Santorum, who has talked about and who has advocated and worked to ban not only abortion but birth control, that you have people like Frank Pastore, who uphold the execution of gays. This is a Christian fundamentalist and a biblical literalist. And that you have been promoting on your...
Uphold the execution of... Would you do that again?
Muslims, we should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity. How can you justify these stands from your spokespeople and still dare to profess concerns for women, concerns for gays, and for people's rights?
Okay. Of course, I need to tell the television audience, I have organized students on 100 college campuses to have an Islamofascism Awareness Week from October 22nd to 26th. And I'll be speaking myself on several campuses. And I've invited speakers to speak. And the thrust of this week is to make people aware of the oppression of Muslim women in Islamic countries like Iran, the oppression of homosexuals, and of course the oppression of Christians, Jews, and Hindus by the Islamo-fascists. The Ann-Coulter statement I've always taken as a satirical statement, since the Islamicists believe that infidels need to be put to the sword or converted. She's just saying that the Mohammed Attas and Zawahiris of this world should be put to the sword and converted to Christianity. It's a joke. It's a satiric, it's a Swiftian comment. I am a great admirer of Rick Santorum. We happen to disagree on the issue of abortion. And I'm not familiar, Frank Pastore, of course, was a pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds, and he's a friend of mine. And I'm not familiar with his comment. But one of the nice things about being a conservative is that you inhabit a political universe where people can disagree with you on pretty profound issues, and you don't get purged. One of the ways that Christopher and I reunited after his, and I disagree with Christopher on
Hitchens.
Christopher Hitchens on an amazing range of things, probably, well, certainly, well, on several things, certainly a little bit on the Middle East, somewhat on, certainly on the God issue, although I'm an agnostic. I don't understand his passion. But one of the ways we reunited was when Christopher crossed an invisible line as a leftist. Yet it was over when Sidney Blumenthal was attacking women for the president, and Christopher told the tale out of school. Yet all these leftists, including, since I've mentioned him already, Todd Gitlin, saying how they weren't going to ever let Christopher darken their door again. That doesn't happen in the right, to my knowledge. People who are pro-abortion and who are pro-choice, people who are pro-immigration, pro-illegal immigration even, and people who are pro-NAFTA and anti-NAFTA, coexist, are friends. It's just a much more pleasant place to be on the conservative side of the spectrum.
You write in your memoir that when you first met Norman Podhoretz, he said to you, when you were on the left, you got away with everything. And now that you're on the right, you better be careful because they won't let you get away with anything.
They won't let you get away with anything, and how right he was. I wrote a 113,000-word book, The Professors, which we looked at before, with a 17,000 or whatever it is word essay on my analysis of the university. And all people did was pick out a word here or there. It's true, I referred to a professor whose name is Elizabeth Perez. 2 times is Elizabeth, and 1 time it got to be Emma. Something that happens if you've ever written a 113,000-word book. And that became the entire issue. And so there's a whole website called Horowitz Fact Checker put up by the teacher unions to try to discredit me. I'm really sort of getting tired of the lefts, and for that previous caller, these people are all people who are easily identifiable as leftists, who won't ever meet an argument. I would say of the dozen or so books I've written as a conservative, not one of them has ever been addressed in a serious way by, I mean the intellectual issues that it raised, starting with Radical Son, The Politics of Bad Faith, which is a serious argument with the left about the implications of the failure of communism. Never have your intellectual issues engaged, but all they do is they call you names, and with one intended purpose, which is to destroy your credibility and to destroy you as a participant in the discussion. And in the book Indoctrination U, I describe how the dean of the faculty at Reed College, which is a very, if you like, liberal, very left-wing college, but I think a very good college, how he attempted to destroy me and got the whole school mad at him for doing so. So we still have a kind of a healthy climate. But you can see this with they're trying to do it to Rush Limbaugh. I mean, he makes a comment. It's the gotcha moment. I hate these gotcha moments, and I hate it when it's done to people on the left as well. One sentence convicts you, you erase a lifetime work because somebody misspoke on one occasion about one thing. I mean, or misspoke on 10 occasions about something. I mean, come on, we're human. To err, remember, is human.
We are going to take one more call and then take a break in which we will show you a little bit about Mr. Horowitz's writing, how he writes, where he writes. Mason Neck, Virginia. Please turn your television set down, caller, and then go ahead.
Hello?
Mason Neck, are you there?
Well, she turned everything off.
I guess so. Well, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back. We have a lot more books to talk about and a lot more issues to talk about. We'll take more of your phone calls.
A typical working day for me is getting up maybe 5 or 6 in the morning. I'm a morning person, obviously, and I think most clearly then. And getting into this chair with my laptop and my 2 little dogs. This is Jake, and this is Lucy. And typing until sunset, probably. I have, in addition to writing, I have to orchestrate an organization. So some of my time is spent with emails and on the phone. But pretty much I spend the whole day writing. Oh, and I'll take the dogs for a walk or go out and visit the horse in the corral. This is Alvin. This is why I bought this place, for Alvin. Yeah. He's busy eating there. My organization it's called the David Horowitz Freedom Center. It's basically to defend free societies against the attacks that have been launched against them since they were first founded at the end of the 18th century. Freedom is regarded by many as a threat, and the forces beginning with the left in the French Revolution, through the totalitarian forces, which, of course, communism derives from the French Revolution. The Bolsheviks saw themselves as the Jacobins. And now, of course, we have the Islamo-fascist threat. We had the threat from the Nazis. All these totalitarian ideologies find freedom intolerable. And actually, if you look up on the shelf there, I have a lot of books by Dostoevsky, who saw this early and wrote what is perhaps the greatest 10 pages on the subject of this battle of the 20th and now the 21st century, called The Grand Inquisitors. This is my communism shelf, books on communism. This is kind of on the left in academia. And this little book is a left-wing book, but it's of my commie camp that I went to. This was a camp run by the Communist Party, Wochika, which was not an Indian name. It meant Workers' Children's Camp, which I'm kind of featured in as the notorious camp alumni. This is a book about my radical mentor, Ralph Miliband, who's no longer with us, but his sons are now the foreign minister in Britain and the chief of staff for the prime minister. Ralph stopped speaking to me when I decided that the left was deluded. This is a front page of the Chronicle of Higher Education, which I guess is a tribute to my efforts to reform higher education and to return it really to liberal principles. Liberal in meaning true to the roots of liberty, where students get a chance to see both sides of a question and they don't sit in a classroom modeled on authoritarian societies where they're told what to think. My campaign has been incredibly misrepresented by the left. Even this headline, pushing politics from left to right, the campaign itself is viewpoint neutral. It just, if there's a controversial issue, let's hear both sides. Freedom is very difficult for most people. The left has entrenched itself in an institution where there's no bottom line. There's the university. If you're not in the hard sciences where ideas are tested by experiment, there's no penalty for bad ideas. So the university is a fount of really bad ideas, tremendous ignorance, which goes under the guise of progressive education. The lessons of communism have not been learned. And in fact, the communist doctrines, so certainly the communist analysis of capitalism is the analysis that you would get in any university. I don't care if it's Harvard or Yale or Berkeley or the University of Arizona. That's what you're going to get. You will learn that corporations are evil, that people are oppressed, and so forth. That the ruling class or the neoliberal order, which is international capitalism, is the greatest menace on earth. That's what you're going to learn if you go to a university these days. not every professor spouts this kind of nonsense, but there, in women's studies and black studies and peace studies and global studies courses, that is the doctrine.
Back with David Horowitz and In Depth for this month. You wrote in Unholy Alliance that your daughter, Sarah, is against the war, or was when you were writing this. Is she still?
Yeah, Sarah is Green Party. She is probably my most political child. I have 4 children. And she's a writer, a very articulate, thoughtful person. And she helped me with Radical Son as well. When you are engaged in these political battles, you can sort of get overwhelmed by your own emotions and intoxicated with your own virtue. And so she's a check on that for me. I have wonderful conversations with my daughter.
Do you still support the war?
Do I support the war?
Mm-hmm.
The war in Iraq, I actually have a book that I just finished. It's about how the Democrats and radicals undermined the war on terror before and after 9/11. The war in Iraq was a good war to fight. Because Saddam Hussein had violated, he was a rogue government. He was supporting terrorists, including Al-Qaeda. This nonsense, it was a secular state. I mean, he had Allahu Akbar in the flag. He hated the United States, and he gave refuge to the Iraqi who designed the bomb that blew up the World Trade Center in 1993. It was the first attack. But most importantly, he broke the truce. We were at war with Saddam for 10 years. We had these no-fly zones where our warplanes flew over northern Iraq to prevent him from using poison gas on the Kurds. No reasonable person can think that if the United States just backed off the confrontation with Saddam and went home, he wouldn't build nuclear weapons. That was the plan. And we know that because the K report revealed, all of the preparations they had. This war has been terribly demagogued. Was it mismanaged? Yes. It's been terribly mismanaged. What Petraeus is doing now should have been attempted 3 years ago. We didn't pursue them, the terrorists, into their lairs, as it were. We didn't try, what we tried in Anbar Province.
Who do you blame for that?
Well, I think it's the people most responsible for the disasters that have occurred in Iraq are Jimmy Carter and Al Gore and Ted Kennedy. But particularly Gore and Carter, because they broke the bipartisan support that we've always had for foreign policy, and particularly for wars. So that when Bush made mistakes, the Democrats, since they started in July 2003, 3 months after the fall of Baghdad, they started attacking Bush as a liar. This is the commander-in-chief of the troops. The troops are in the field. We have just begun the war. And they called him a liar over the 16 words in the State of the Union, which happened to be true. But they called him a liar about the reasons for going to war. So the leaders of the Democratic Party, beginning with Carter and Gore, who actually had attacked him earlier, Carter, we took a Nobel Prize that was designed to slap his own president in the face. What they were attacking was the rationale for the war. It's one thing to attack a war policy. It's to say, oh, you don't like the methods that are used for interrogations. You think we should have more troops. We should or shouldn't have created a government so quickly. All of those are legitimate criticisms. But the Democrats, from the beginning, within 3 months of the war, were saying Bush lied to get us into the war. That this war is immoral, illegal, based on a falsehood, and unnecessary. So they attacked the very basis of the war. That boxed the president in from the beginning. He didn't have the flexibility. How can you, when you are under that kind of attack, how can you take the criticisms, and adjust to them and respond to them and so forth?
Back to.
So anyway, that was. That's for a future show. It shouldn't be part of this.
Back to, when does the book come out? The next book.
The book should be out in March.
Back to the phones. We go to Churchill, Pennsylvania, Republican line.
Yes. Good afternoon.
Hi. Hi.
Yeah, I do agree with David with respect to the race and radical feminism, and as well as open inquiry at the university level. But it does seem to, David seems to be in support of President Ahmadinejad's position on the Holocaust, that further studies needed to see the causes and the consequences. But in any event, I have a few comments and a question. Incidentally, David really is not a conservative. He's a neocon, and neocons really, they violate President George Washington's advice during his last speech when he said that we should avoid passionate attachments, in David's case, to Israel. But in any event, on October 2nd, in the Chicago Tribune, we had some Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporters that devoted a lot of time to investigate the 40th anniversary of the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, when we had 40 dead and 160 injured. In any event, they really proved pretty conclusively that the Israelis certainly knew they were attacking an American vessel. And in the last 3 or 4 years, lots of the sailors and the lawyers involved at the time for the government, they've come out and they've indicated that they were coerced not to tell the truth at the time 40 years ago.
Caller, can you wrap that into a question?
Yeah, I just think it's real appropriate that David's on today, when tonight you're having Walsh and Mersheimer, authors of the Israeli Lobby, which is probably the most significant foreign policy book we've had in a generation. But yeah, my question would be, we can find out how interested David really is for full inquiry and open discussion, but David, would you support a full investigation into the attack on the USS Liberty?
So out of this incoherent series of comments, all I get is that this man doesn't like Jews, and that he thinks that Jews are somehow behind American policy, the war on terror, and everything David Horowitz does. I actually have never been to Israel, so I'm not sure what he means by my passionate attachment to Israel. I'm familiar vaguely with the Liberty. It's been investigated. I'm not part of the military investigations. All of this is really irrelevant. Even the question about having Walt and Mearsheimer. That's what I said about C-SPAN. That everybody's on C-SPAN. It's a fair-minded. You get two sides of a discussion, which is more than you get in a lot of classrooms and our most prestigious universities in this country. I don't really think that the comments are worth addressing.
New York, go ahead.
Hello.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead, please. Democrat line.
Hello,
Hi.
David.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Listen, first of all, I'd like to tell people that they should really check out your website, frontpagemagazine.com. In there, they should take a look at the articles and read the comments that go there. They are idiotic, childish, full of hate. So that's about your academic discourse that you're encouraging. And I think people should check that out. They will really be shocked. I mean, it's not that you can judge people by their websites, but I think in your case it is indicative of where you're coming from. You have a good shtick. I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, please get
What
to
do you think about social democracy institutions in Europe? I'm talking about the universities, the type of governments they have, which are heavily, heavily influenced by socialism, that dirty word, okay, where they have an attitude that health care should be a right, my God. And also, I'd be interested to know this whole Islamo-fascist thing, which is just pure race baiting and whatever. What do you think of the American fascists, the Christo and Jewish fascists, many of whom are, like you, neoconservatives, as that fellow just said?
David Horowitz.
What fascists? What is it? Well, the viewers should go to Front Page, which is not an academic magazine, but not designed that way, but it's designed as a polemical magazine, and compare it to the name calling of this caller and see who's more civilized. If they want to look at my academic website, it's at studentsforacademicfreedom.org. It's a whole completely different website and has a different tone and way of addressing things. We live in a culture where if people are coming at you polemically, you go back at them polemically, and if people are coming at you in a civilized or discussing matters in a civilized way, that's the way you do that, or a more elevated way, I should say. Since polemics are not necessarily uncivilized; they're just polemics. My concern with universities is that they ought to be elevating the dialogue and educating people, and not just be part of the political food fights. I think that Europe. First of all, I can't this is a long program, but even in a program this size, you don't get into a extensive discussion of the mixed economies. But I don't actually know any conservatives who want to take away the entire safety net and don't want government to do anything but the functions it did, say, before the New Deal. And I certainly don't. Europe, of course, exists because of the American military. If it weren't for the American Europe doesn't raise a dime for its own defense. Europe is under the American umbrella, whether the threat is coming from Iran or whether the threat comes from from Russia. Or whatever the threat is, the Europeans have this luxury, which I think we should reappraise, of depending on Americans to defend them. Their economies are stagnant, their unemployment rates are astronomical, and they obviously don't assimilate immigrant communities like the Muslims in France very well, who have burned something like 50,000 automobiles. So I don't hardly think that European social democracy is something we should emulate. And I've had experience with the national healthcare system in England, which I would not like to see repeated in this country.
You lived there how long?
I lived in England for 4 years in the 60s.
How in the 60s?
Yeah.
You were, what, in your 20s at that time?
Yeah, I was in my 20s. I had 2 children who were born in England. I worked for Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, at the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation.
He was still alive.
Oh yeah. I describe, in Radical Son, I describe going to I believe it was his 92nd birthday party in Wales. Quite an experience. I also describe in Radical Son sort of refereeing an encounter between Joan Baez and Russell. He had no idea who she was, and she certainly had no idea who he was. And she was talking about her guru, Ira Sandpearl, to the supreme rationalist philosopher. It was kind of, I actually was in severe distress because I was very young and I wanted to make it work, but it's kind of amusing in retrospect.
Los Angeles, go ahead.
Hi, I want to make a comment and then ask a question to David. I think it's important to know that David wrote The Art of Political War in the year 2000 that Karl Rove and Tom DeLay thought was so useful and valuable that they sent it to the entire Republican Congress and out to their operatives around the country. And also I've read that David was involved intimately in the storming of the ballot counting going on in Miami at the end of the 2000 election that was important in getting Bush elected. So I think your viewers need to know that David is a highly connected person to some very powerful people in this country. And what that means is his assault on critical thinking in academia is very dangerous. Two of the people on the top of his hit list, a tenured professor in Colorado, Ward Churchill, and a internationally regarded scholar, Norman Finkelstein at DePaul, trying to get tenure, have been purged in the last few months very much because of the work of David Horowitz. Now, the question, and his Islamofascism Awareness Week is intended to storm the campuses with this attempt to repackage a war of aggression that the U.S. is waging as a war in defense of civilization, us or fascism. Now, the question I have for David is...
Caller, I'm going to stop there because there's a lot on your plate.
I would like to, I hope that the Democrat who was a Vietnam vet is watching, because this is a leftist. And except for the first fact, everything that he said is made up. I did write a little book called The Art of Political War. I don't know if you have it, but
I don't think so.
It's okay. I did it as a pamphlet. And Karl Rove did make a nice comment on it. He said it was the perfect guide to winning on the political battlefield, but he ignored all its advice. I sent it out personally to a lot of people. Karl Rove never sent it out to anybody, nor did Tom DeLay. I never went. I wasn't within 3,000 miles of Florida. He claimed that I was part of storming the.
Were you part of any discussions?
I was
with
not
people?
part of anything. No, I had absolutely nothing to do that. I've never been employed by the Republican Party. You know, I'm as fed up with the way the Republican Party has been acting lately as the rest of the base. I did not attack Ward Churchill. I mean, you know, I've written harsh things about Ward Churchill, but I went into the pages of the Denver Rocky Mountain News. I wrote an op-ed right at the height of when it first broke, the scandal, and the governor of the state, who's a personal friend of mine, was calling for Churchill to be fired. And I wrote an op-ed piece defending Churchill and saying you cannot fire a professor for what he says in an op-ed column. So all of that. I've never, I don't believe I've ever written anything about Finkelstein, who was this professor at DePaul. Who, so all of this is made up. And the Art of Political War basically says this. It says that the left and Democrats and liberals regard politics as war conducted by other means. That's the way they regard it. And Republicans regard politics as a management problem. I mean, I've seen, my friend Newt Gingrich on television said, if Republicans manage things right, people will elect us. And no, the opposite is true. Actually, Dick Morris just had a column about this. If you get to be the victim of your successes. If you clean up, crime is no longer the problem it was during the Clinton years, so you can't run on the crime issue. We've been safe since 9/11. That is, America hasn't been attacked. There's nobody on the day after 9/11 who would have bet that 6 years later we wouldn't have been attacked. That is the success of the Bush administration. That allows Democrats to pretend that the war on terror is a bumper sticker and not to understand that if we lose that war in Iraq, and I actually didn't finish that part, Iran wins. So you're going to have, Iraq I think has the biggest oil reserves, but the Iranian oil, Iraqi oil, that whole peninsula, they will go after Saudi Arabia and they will attack us here. So we have to win that war. That's basically it. And I guarantee you, if Hillary Clinton is elected president, she will stay in Iraq and win the war, because no American president can't do that.
In 2002, you wrote this book, How to Beat the Democrats.
Yes, I had two political seasons. I did the Art of Political War, and then I followed it with these are both, I did two pamphlets, which are the first parts of both books, long pamphlets. And this was the second one. It was for the 2002 campaign.
And you write about
But those are the only two I've done. And the fact of the matter is, even though a lot of Republicans do like these books, it was never taken up by the Republican Party. It's never been distributed by the Republican National Committee. And as a result, I think they don't benefit from its advice. But the advice, let me just say what the advice was. Since war is, politics is war conducted by other means, in politics, and in America in particular, it's us versus them. That's the mentality that the Democrats have, so you have to have it back. And the way you win is by championing the underdog. That is, in America, everybody thinks of themselves as an underdog. You know, just ask Martha Stewart or Britney Spears or what have you. Everybody feels picked on. So if you can position your side on the side of the underdog, women, minorities, the poor, children, this is the Democratic theme. Republicans are anti-children, anti-women. So Republicans just have to show how Democrats, and one of the things I say in this, and it's very simple. If you look at every inner city in America, and this is where you have masses of Hispanic and black minorities who are very poor and live in horrible environments. Every one of the inner cities in America is 100% controlled by the Democratic Party and has been for like nearly 100 years. Everything that's wrong with the inner cities, the Democrats are responsible for. So Democrats have their boot heels on the necks of poor people. Why are Republicans saying this? So my book, which this left-wing caller wants to portray as extremely sinister, is saying to the Republicans, you have to get on the side of poor people, minorities, championing, champion their causes. And I actually thought Bush was going to do this. No child left behind and stuff like that. Unfortunately, it didn't go very far.
You also say timing is important. The basic tactical rule of warfare is to start your campaign with an artillery barrage that pins your opponents down. While he is scrambling to defend himself, you can proceed with your attack.
My artillery barrage is that statement. Democrats, they control, are responsible for what happens in America's inner cities. Take Katrina. And that's the artillery barrage. You start by identifying Democrats as the oppressors of the poor, the oppressors of black people. They're the ones who created a welfare system that destroyed the inner city black community. You take Katrina. Who was in charge in Katrina? Who was in charge of getting people out? The black Democratic mayor, Ray Nagin of New Orleans. Every death in that city, he's the one responsible for not getting the buses to pull these people out. And in the second instance, it's a Democratic governor. But Republicans are tongue-tied. Bush made a huge, and he's paid for it, but unforgivable, not to be at the site of the Katrina disaster right away and to go to a fundraiser. Correct. But the Republicans, while they're tongue-tied, instead of blaming Nagin, the Democrats, the Democratic Party of Louisiana, for that disaster, allow a vacuum where the Democrats come in and accuse them. And my point in How to Beat the Democrats and the passage you just read is the Democrats are going to do this to you every time they get out there. They're not going to be held up by considerations of principle or honesty or anything. It's politics. Politics is a form of warfare. There's no fairness. There are no rules. There's nobody to arbitrate. So the only thing that you can do to defend yourself even is to attack the Democrats first, and to do it on the same grounds that they're going to attack you. That's what the books say.
Glen Ellen, Virginia.
Good afternoon, Connie and Mr. Horowitz. A pleasure to talk to you, David. Read your book, The Professors. In fact, I'm giving it to a friend of mine. You say early in the book on that, I got a comment and a couple of questions. You say early in the book that the university is to be is a temple of the intellect and is supposed to be used for research and teaching. I agree with that, and I agree with your analysis of most of the professors in there. I've got a couple of questions. What do you think about your about the Iranian president, Mr. Ahmadinejad, being invited to speak at your old alma mater, Columbia? And how did Columbia get to be such a radical university? It seems that most of the Ivy League colleges hold most of the radical professors. The university is supposed to foster critical thinking and intellectual freedom. But it seems that the Ivies have become really radical. I'd like to see, and Connie, thank you for C-SPAN. I've been a long-time C-SPAN viewer, and I'm a 20-year Army veteran, a Gulf War veteran, and Vietnam-era veteran. And thank you very much for taking my comment today.
Well, first, thank you for your service to this country and to the cause of freedom. I don't think the Ivies are the worst of the lot. I just did an article which is archived at a Front Page magazine called The Worst School in America, which is about the University of California, Santa Cruz. And it's certainly, if it were just confined to the Ivies, it wouldn't be a problem. As I say, 85% of our students go to state institutions, and the problem is huge there. Ahmadinejad is a Nazi. A genocidal Nazi who has openly, I mean, actually worse than Hitler in the sense that Hitler concealed from the German people that he wanted to exterminate the Jews, calculating, I guess, the German people were too civilized to hear that. Ahmadinejad has shouted from the rooftops that he wants to obliterate the Jewish state and is leading a worldwide movement to do this. Ahmadinejad is supplying the IEDs that are killing young American men and women in Iraq. Ahmadinejad is an enemy of this country. We can't prevent him from going to the UN, but the Bush administration should have prevented him from leaving whatever that kind of international plot of land is. You don't want to humanize and make this guy seem like somebody that you can talk to until he pulls those IEDs out of Iraq in the first place. The IEDs being the roadside bombs that are killing most of the deaths in Iraq now for our troops are from these Iranian devices. It's like inviting Hitler in 1939 to the United States, and giving him a platform at Columbia University. This is not a free speech issue. We're in war, and I think the Bush administration will historically be seen to have done the right thing in taking on Saddam Hussein, in calling it a war on terror, in going into Afghanistan. All of that will be right, but he will be faulted for not proceeding with the logic of being in war. And he has not persuaded, or has not even attempted in a serious way. They have not done a campaign to make the American people understand why we're fighting the war. And then to treat Ahmadinejad like he's just some state leader with some bad ideas, that's not very serious in terms of the war that we're defending. We may be in there militarily. You don't know. I think it's a very bad situation. And I'd say I was embarrassed by my university, but Columbia's done this many things to be embarrassed by.
Tony Sanders emails this question: do you ever wonder if what you're doing is good for the country? The angry white male has been angry for the better part of 20 years, even though his candidates or party has won 5 out of the last 7 national elections. Will you ever be happy?
Well, the person who wrote this is a sexist, obviously, and a racist. This kind of language is ridiculous. Why am I an angry white male? I haven't been angry to begin with. I mean, I can get passionate about the war, but who doesn't get passionate about the war?
People see you on television. They see you debating.
Listen, I've raised more money for inner city black projects than any 100 of this woman's friends and relatives. I have spent my life fighting, civil rights battles. If anybody who reads my books knows that I think that enormous damage has been done by people like this woman who wrote the email to black people. When you are against, police profiling, what does that mean? That means that drug dealers and criminals are going to, not be apprehended. Who are the victims? Black people. The victims of black criminals are black people. To obstruct police methods in fighting black criminals is to expose innocent black people and law-abiding black people to their predations. The left, as I say, it doesn't have an argument. All it does is name call. It likes to refight the Civil War. It likes to have issues that are so simple that nobody could possibly disagree with their positions. So if somebody has a different, she didn't even say what the point of view.
He actually.
He didn't even say what the point of view he didn't like is. If he disagrees with my analysis of universities, if he disagrees with my position on Democrats, that if he doesn't think the Democrats actually do control the inner cities, instead of arguing the point, he puts the label on me, angry white male. He might have well said racist white male, because that's what he was intending.
Mount Clair, Virginia.
This is just, it's so boring.
Mount Clair, Virginia.
Good afternoon. Well, I wish I had written everything down so that I would remember, but I agree with Mr. Horowitz, and I just want to get his thoughts on what my assessment of the left has been, and the Democrats and the so-called black leadership. The way I see it is that the left tends to believe that they have a superior. The white left tend to believe that they're superior. They should behave superior. They're elitist, and that other people, including Ahmadinejad and other people of color, this is the way I see it, are inferior, and therefore they could not have done anything like attack the United States. They didn't have the know-how to come up against the great white people who said, if it was an inside job. The reasons you have a lot of black people living in the conditions in the inner cities ran by Democrats is because of the belief that the inferiority and superiority mind set, that the white people have better ideas, better thoughts, better equipped, better history, better everything, and therefore they have all of the answers. And I don't see it that way. I just see people as being people and experiences as being experiences, and I see people as being a person that happens to be a race. However, it's almost like how Clarence Thomas is called angry because he recounts what happened to him and the way you're called angry. But it's kind of hard for me to really put my finger on exactly what it is. I just think that the left, the colleges, the professors, and all of that, they really believe in a white superiority frame.
Thanks, Virginia. We'll leave it at that.
You're absolutely right. I mean, this is the stance of the left generally, that the Democrats want government to take care of you because they don't think you can take care of yourself. Hillary, as said, when she's devising her healthcare system, government has to do this because it's too important to be left to people. They don't want, and it's true. Some people do screw up their lives, but it's a kind of paternal view that liberals tend to have of black people and minorities, and it's one reason I think that they are so much in denial on the war on terror. When they look at, Ahmadinejad tells you exactly what he thinks. This is a guy who thinks that the 12th Imam, who died, I believe it was in the 10th century, is about to return, and Armageddon will ensue, and that the way to make him return quickly is by nuclear war, sowing chaos, drop a bomb on Israel or some other Middle Eastern country, that the Jews Israel needs to be wiped from the face of the earth. Of course, he doesn't believe that there are no homosexuals in Iran because he's executed about 4,000 of them that we know of. So when liberals hear this, and they hear these lunatic fundamentalists, because they're of color, they discount what they say. They can't really mean that. Whereas a benign religious figure like Jerry Falwell, who would never hurt a fly, who may have said some stupid things in his lifetime that he had to apologize for, that's the big threat. Christian fundamentalists, that's what they fear in this country. Christian fundamentalists who obey the laws, who accept defeats in elections, when they lose, who live side by side in peace with their neighbors, they're a huge threat. But these Islamic fundamentalists who've conducted 9,000 terrorist attacks since 9/11, who've killed hundreds of thousands of people. In Algeria, they killed 200,000 Muslims. These people are misunderstood. And it's America's fault if they have, say bad things. They don't really mean them, or if they do bad things, of course, we're responsible. It's George Bush created the terrorists. If we leave Iraq, the terrorists will leave too. I saw Nancy Pelosi say that on television. This is just lunatic thinking, but it flows out of a feelings of moral superiority. That seems to be endemic to the liberal or left position.
How long have you had your organization?
I started, the center was originally called the Center for the Study of Popular Culture in 1988. And I gave it that name to make it difficult for people to attack me, because I know that's what the left does. So I put the word study in.
And what's it called now?
And 2 years ago, my board confronted me with the fact that people do not understand what Center for Study of Popular Culture means, that conservatives, when they hear the word culture, probably think left-wing, that the way we raise money for the center is that people identify with what I do. So they renamed it, and they insisted that it have the name David Horowitz, and so it's the David Horowitz Freedom Center. It's been there for a couple of years.
How is it funded?
We have now 85,000 individuals who send money to the center. The average donation is $25 or $50, so it's a very democratically funded organization. I get some money. I get about 10% of my money from foundations, but most of it is from individuals.
Which foundations?
The usual kind of suspects. Actually, there were only two left. I originally got money from Bradley, Olin, and Scaife, and now I still get some money from Bradley and Scaife. But it's 10%. I mean, I hope they're not listening, but if they pulled out their money, I would still be there tomorrow. And I have, it's very interesting to me the way the left thinks, because the left's foundations are about somewhere between 10 and 15 times times the size. That's right, something like that. I got to think it's 15 to 1, 15 times the size in assets. The Ford Foundation, which is a huge funder of the left, is a 10 or 11 billion dollar foundation. All the conservative foundations combined don't come up to that, near that, or probably less than $1 billion. I mean, so the left has no problem with all of its operatives that live on foundation grants and are funded, and are funded by one or two people. George Soros is all over the left in funding. But if a conservative takes a dime from Dick Scaife, first they demonized Dick Scaife, a perfectly decent, wonderful American. They demonized him to the point at which a deranged leftist tried to kill him, but fortunately committed suicide. He went right up to the floor of the Scaife Foundation, the 39th floor of the building the Scaife Foundation is in, and blew his own brains out in the bathroom. I can't get over it how much the left is driven by hatred of people. I mean, I don't have. I get along fine with Ward Churchill. I mean, there are probably some conservatives out there that will guess, but I debated Ward, and he was perfectly amusing. I had a really good time with him. We discussed The Last of the Mohicans. For anybody who's seen it, there's this really terrible Indian in it, the bad Indian, Magua. Well, of course, that was Ward's hero in the movie. So I don't have these personal things where, and I have to go, when I go to campuses, I have to have bodyguards. Ann Coulter has to have bodyguards. We've been physically attacked. That's why we take the bodyguards.
Actually, we have some video of you at Duke University where your bodyguard was standing behind you.
Oh yeah, that's a long time ago. That's Terry.
Now you have bodyguards with you every time you go to a campus?
Oh no, that's Floyd. That's not that long ago. Yeah. Because I've been attacked. I actually appeared at the Beverly Wilshire. It's a 4-star hotel. We had a little event at the Beverly Wilshire, and 2 members of the Revolutionary Communist Party, 2 huge members, rushed the stage. And if it weren't for Melrose Larry Green, who used to be on the Howard Stern show, he's a little guy, and he rushed the stage to tackle them. And then Jason Apuzzo runs the Liberty Film Festival, which is part of my operation. They had to be physically, I mean, they had to be wrestled to the floor. It was really, and I'm getting on in years, so,
How old are you?
Look at it. I'm 68 years old. I'll be 69 shortly, so I'm not looking forward to being attacked. And, I wish that weren't the case, but it is. And I would say, I hold university administrators responsible. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the International Socialist Organization, these are organizations that regularly obstruct speeches. They should not be recognized. They should get no student funds, and their leaders should be expelled from the university when they do that. And I would say this if there was a right-wing organization that was breaking up speeches by Angela Davis or Cornel West, but there isn't.
When you were going around for the professors, like at that program at Duke University, the video that we showed, you had some folks in the audience ask you questions.
Oh yeah, this was outrageous. There were 600 or 700 people who came to hear me speak. I guarantee you the vast majority weren't conservatives. They were students who came to hear what I had to say, and I gave a question. But there were 30 females, students, who were sitting with 3, I didn't realize this at the time, 3 professors they orchestrated them to cackle like chipmunks, giggle. Every time I made a statement, they would go, and it sounded like Alvin and the Chipmunks. It's very distracting. It was so annoying to the audience that a student got up and said, I am a leftist and I am embarrassed by your behavior. Please stop so I can listen to what's going on.
Let me show.
But they kept doing it.
Let's show our viewers a question that came out of that.
I actually have 3 very short questions. The first is, why didn't I make it into your book? I know my book is shorter than yours. Yeah. It was only 398 pages, but I wish I'd made it in the book. I tried very hard. I'm sorry, can I just ask the questions?
You asked the question, I'm going to answer it.
Secondly, we were promised professors exposed. So I guess I was hoping for a little more TNA. And 3, I wonder if you could get so little funding for this, how you managed to pay for so many full-page ads in the Chronicle, for all of the advertising.
Duke Student Government and Young Americans Foundation.
I will answer this. For those who can't see, this young woman is wearing a T-shirt, "Why didn't I make the list?" The answer is, I guess you weren't smart enough. Next.
Did you enjoy that give and take?
I wish I had known at the time that was Diane Nelson. She's this is an absolute disgrace. She's a tenured professor of anthropology. She was the head of undergraduate studies for the anthropology department. What she did, she's the one who orchestrated the interruptions, which is a violation of Duke rules. I wrote a letter, and the student who invited me wrote a letter to Broadhead, the president at Duke, asking him to discipline her, just to say this is just not acceptable behavior. This is the same president who terminated the season of the lacrosse team and cast 3 innocent students to the wolves, who were, to the lynch party. That this woman is on a faculty. I mean, I've read her book. She went to Guatemala and she fraternized with the communists in Guatemala, and that's what her book is about. And the big issue in her book, this is how she got her tenure through this book, is that the revolutionaries they were fraternizing with raped one of the women who were progressives, who was part of her group, that were going to help them. And since they're oppressed people, how do we work through this with them? If I read this in one of the urban throwaways, or in some political party journal, but this was this is the subject of a 400-page book that this woman got her tenure with, and she, by the way, got a PhD from Stanford. And if that woman doesn't symbolize what's wrong with our universities, then nothing does.
Maui, go ahead.
I believe that Mr. Horowitz's strong belief system will not let him hear arguments, reason, or independent thought. So I have 2 questions, actually. How does Mr. Horowitz accurately measure or evaluate the teachers that teach the right doctrine, the doctrine that he agrees with? Is that his benchmark? And also, I find it puzzling to call Jerry Falwell benign when he said 9/11 was because of the abortionists and the gays. Could you please explain?
Yeah, okay. Notice, I mean, she accuses me of not being... this woman hasn't read anything that I've written, quite obviously. My books are actually long, extended arguments with all the left, the positions. As I say, they haven't been answered. Nobody's, the left has called me a lot of names. That's just what this...
Her question, though, was how would you measure the work of a professor who was doing the right thing?
I thought she meant a right-wing professor.
I'm sorry, I might have misunderstood her.
I use the same standard to judge right and left on this. My academic freedom campaign is nonpartisan, and it has the only reason it's a polarized issue is because the American Association of University, the teacher unions, attacked me in a partisan way. They brought up the art of political war. They claimed it was a Bush-Rove plot. I mean, it's just ridiculous. If you read the Bill of Rights, it doesn't mention politics at all. And if you read the professors, I say that this is not a book about academic bias, because everybody has a bias. Everybody has a point of view. And it's a right of a left-wing professor to express their left-wing points of view. What they have to do is they have to do it in a professional manner, which means if an issue is controversial, You have to let the students know it's controversial and give them access to a point of view that differs from yours, which is what I would do if I were teaching.
This emailer asks you to do specifically just that. Leela Silver of Chicago says, if you were to teach a course to college-age students, how would you even begin to convey how and why Marxism dominated 20th century thought, culture, and values?
Oh, that's a little different. I was going to say, if I were teaching, because I'm a fairly high profile, I would go out of my way to make the left-wing kids in the class comfortable, and to move away even from my positions and just try to present them in a way that would stimulate. The idea of a teaching is that you get the students to think. You guys, this is what the evidence is. Now, you guys got to figure it out. I'm not going to figure it out for you.
Now, if the students already know what the teacher's background is, though, isn't it a little tough for them to?
It is,
to make
and that's
that
why
case?
I say I'd make an extra effort. And this question about why Marxism is so dominant, it is a religion. Look, just to go back to this issue, the rise of it's Darwin is the big turning point, and since we've had all these God books or no God books, the 19th century is really the crisis of religious faith. That religions, organized religion and religions, were a way of consoling people for the meaninglessness of their lives. Our lives without a God to redeem our existence, without a redemption, without a future paradise, our lives are utterly meaningless. And actually, I'm working with Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor who wrote a very famous Meditations. It was said that the only thing you really should be thinking about is how you're going to exit this world, and you're going to be forgotten, and everything that seemed important to you has vanished, and will vanish, just the way everything that went before you has vanished. It's a terrible thing for a human being to have to face. So one of the consolations is, and I don't want to prejudice the issue, I'm an agnostic. I'm not with Christopher saying there's no God and religion is just, hooey. But either there is a God who redeems this or there's not. Now, for people who think there's not, life would be intolerable unless they had another hope. And that hope, Marxism is the most articulate, and Marx was a really good writer, even though he was a crackpot economist. A secular messianism, a secular redemption, is what a lot of people have found the consolation in. So the rise of these, and it's no accident, and as we used to say as Marxists, no accident that we have this outpouring of bestsellers by Dawkins, by there's two Harrises, aren't there? I forget.
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris, by Christopher. There's obviously a whole atheist movement, but they have a similar, they have a religious passion, which is that if we get rid of religion, then we're going to have the rationality, the Enlightenment. Well, no, we're not. No, we're not. Marxism is an Enlightenment philosophy, and look at the unbelievable misery that Marxists have caused. There is no exit. But that explains why Marxism is resurgent. Atheists can't do without some kind of faith, and Marxism is as articulate a faith as the one devised by Mohammed or whoever wrote the 5 books of the Torah, or whoever wrote the New Testament.
Mesa, Arizona.
Good afternoon, Mr. Horowitz, and thank you for your books on the professors and Indoctrination U. Both of them have helped my son in his first 2 years at the university be much more pragmatic in discerning the information. My question to you is, I noticed earlier you mentioned Noam Chomsky. When in my graduate studies for both of my master's degree, currently in my field of teaching, I'm noticing that the professors are teaching Chomsky and his followers theories and hypotheses as absolute science. So we are now having teachers in the K through 12 program who've been taught and accepted theory and hypothesis as truth. How do we combat that? And I'm going to hang up and listen. Thank you.
Well, one thing you can do is buy this book, The Anti-Chomsky Reader. I take it you're not talking about his linguistics, you're talking about his lunatic political tracts. Chomsky is obsessed by hatred for America and Israel. Since he's an American and a Jew, I guess there's some psychological foundation for that. In my book, How to Beat the Democrats, I have an essay. It's actually reprinted in this book on Chomsky. There's little I could say about this individual that would express my disgust at his writings and my sense of what a low intellectual standard he has. I mean, this is somebody who said that Pearl Harbor was a good thing because it's the revenge of the oppressed third world on America. Of course, Japanese imperialism, which was responsible for Pearl Harbor, set world records for its atrocities committed in China and the rest of Southeast Asia against other people of color, a phrase I detest. I mean, it's a French phrase. We don't talk that way, people of color, but whatever. So all that motivates Chomsky is the hatred of the United States. There's no logic in saying that Pearl Harbor was a good thing. If you care, as Chomsky pretends to, about third world people, because the Japanese were monsters. Japanese imperialism was a monstrous historical force. They tore babies in half in front of their mothers. They buried, villages alive. It was just terrible what they did. And the United States did a tremendous service to all the people in Asia by defeating the Japanese Empire. So just the remark that that Pearl Harbor was a good thing, how do you even deal with that intellectually? I mean, this is just such a psychotic expression, psychotic outburst, which reveals that what drives Chomsky is not any intellectual. I mean, he's not a stupid man. I mean, he's a brilliant intellect. But what's driving him is not intellectual issues, but this emotional detestation of his own country.
We have less than a half an hour left. I want to make sure that we talk about this book. When was it published and what's it about?
Yes, everybody take a deep breath after that last moment. This is one of the books that I feel best about having written. This, along with Radical Son, these are my two best books. This is not a political book, although it's not a political book. It is about the end of time. It's about these issues we discussed. It deals a lot with the Catholic philosopher Blaise Pascal, but it's a personal story. It tells several stories. It tells about, I had a prostate cancer, and it describes that as an encounter with my mortality. It describes my romance and marriage with my wonderful wife. But it's a philosophical book about facing one's mortality and dealing with it. It has really on the Walter Isaacson, who is he wrote this present bestseller on Einstein. He wrote a wonderful book on Benjamin Franklin. He wrote a book on Kissinger. He was the editor of Time and is now the head of the Aspen Institute and does not share my politics at all. Wrote a wonderful encomium to the book. It's on the back cover if you maybe you just read what Walter Isaacson said.
He said this is a poignant and powerful rumination on the meaning of life and the meaning of death.
Yeah. However, I was punished for my political sins by, New York Times and Washington Post and all the organs that matter to writers ignored the book, even though it's
ask you about
as good as anything that I've ever written.
Specific point here. You say, what I had learned through the most painful experiences of my life was to pay attention to the differences. It was a lesson at odds with the moral teachings that had come down to us across the millennia. All the prophets, Moses, Jesus, Buddha, the Hindu gurus, have taught an opposite truth, that however different we may look and act, we are one. High and low, strong and weak, virtuous and sinful, we are all incarnations of the same divine spirit. Underneath our various skins, we are all kin. There but for the grace of God go I. But do we? You asked the question.
Yes. Every religious injunction is love thy neighbor as thyself. We're all one. And there, but for the grace of God go I. But the reason for it is that we actually are very different. I don't feel any kinship with a child molester or somebody who tortures children, rapes them and tortures them. I don't have any understanding of that person. I don't have any kinship with them. And in my life, I have made the mistake over and over. I mean, getting involved with the Panthers. I was a very bookish person, and I thought if you have these values, you won't murder somebody. But they murdered Betty Van Patter, This is where we began this conversation. I didn't pay attention to the enormous differences between people. And everybody who's been through a relationship that's broken up or a divorce knows that other person is, in their deepest sense, they're always going to be a stranger. People can be married for 35 years and not in some way know that person or understand or have the appropriate empathy. So you have to keep these two things in mind. We should strive to be a community. We should strive to be kind to each other. But we should always ask ourselves, is this person really reacting to this the way I am? Because if they're not, I'm going to be disappointed, and I may be hugely damaged, depending on what kind of a relationship you're in.
When did you marry your current wife that you write about in this book?
I met, I described the meeting with April. I met her in 1993. And we've been technically married since 1998, so it's almost going on 10 wonderful years for me.
Your fourth marriage?
Yes. Well, I describe in Radical Son, I was married to my first wife, whom I'm still good friends with, and as a wonderful mother to my children and grandmother to my grandchildren. I was with her for 20 years. And I've been with April, my present wife, for close to 14. And that more speaks to who I am. The other two marriages were part of the chaos that ensued in my life after Betty was killed. And it's why I understand how my politics was a religious faith. Because my whole life was organized around the idea that one day we will get to the socialist kingdom of heaven and people will live differently. So I always tried never to betray what I would have called socialist man, but what would have been, not to betray that vision. You be honest, you act with integrity, you are compassionate. Those are all the values that I wanted to see reflected in the real world. In the socialist tomorrow.
Why did you decide or come to the conclusion to write about your affair with Abby Rockefeller, your extramarital affairs?
My book, Radical Son, I guess a lot of people read Radical Son, and one of the attractions for it is the self-disclosure. And I did the most embarrassing moments that I felt were relevant. I mean, everybody has embarrassing moments that are just ridiculous, but that were relevant to my life, because I was very unforgiving, as it were, with radicals, with the people that I had spent so much time with. And I felt that for the book to have a credibility and to have integrity, I had to be ruthless with myself. And I think that everybody who reads that book will agree that I was ruthless with myself.
Los Angeles, go ahead.
Hi, please don't cut me off. I haven't called Book TV in over 30 days. I have to address some key points that have been disingenuous by Mr. Horowitz. First of all, if you want to see what he's all about, do a Google search for Thinking About Neoconservatism. It's an article by Kevin McDonald, the esteemed professor from California State University, Long Beach. And what it conveys is that Jewish neoconservatives like Mr. Horowitz are trying to throw up a smokescreen to make us think that we're fighting wars in the Middle East for quote-unquote democracy and similar, when we're really fighting wars for Israel.
Mr. Horowitz.
Yeah, Kevin McDonald is a well-known anti-Semite, it's one of the criticisms that I fully accept of the professors. He should have been in the professors. I don't know what his politics are. I mean, it doesn't really matter to me. I have never described myself as a neoconservative, and I'm not sure what it means, except that you're Jewish and you support the war in Iraq. When you understand that the Islamic Jihad, Palestine Islamic Jihad, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas are all part of the jihad, and you understand what the jihad is about. The jihad is a holy war against the West, against infidels. You can't really separate the war in the Middle East from the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. Nobody who understands the forces that we're up against could believe that for a second. The reason that Israel, that Ahmadinejad wants to exterminate Israel, is because it's not a Muslim state. They already, Lebanon used to be a Christian democracy. They destroyed it because it wasn't an Islamic state. This is all about an Islamic crusade, which will destroy everything in its path and dominate it. And that's my view of it. It has, not about the state of Israel. It's about the state of the West, if you like. The Hamas charge. Anyway, I don't have to. One thing people should understand: the conflict in the Middle East is not about land. The land in the Middle East never belonged to Palestinians, and it didn't even, for 400 years until 1920, belong to Arabs. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany in the First World War, and so France and England wound up in charge of the territories of the Turkish. It's a Turkish empire, not an Arabian empire. And they had a mandate, which was called the Palestine Mandate, because it was in an area that the Romans had called Palestine because the Philistines inhabited it. The Philistines being Greeks with red hair. Anyway, the Palestine Mandate, 80% of it in 1922 was given by Winston Churchill. The 100% had been promised to the Jews, who had lived there for 3,000 years. 80% was given to Jordan. Jordan is a 70% Palestinian state. Nobody wants to overthrow, or none of these people who think that it's all about Palestinian self-determination give a hoot about the 70% of Jordan that are Palestinians. Why? Because Jordan is Muslim and Arab, and that's what they care about. So they concentrate on this teeny little sliver of land called Israel, which is 10 miles wide at the widest point. And so anti-Israel, anti-Zionism has become modern anti-Semitism. And where that leads is to the gas chambers. And Kevin McDonald and this caller are part of that movement, I don't have any sympathy with them.
Salem, Oregon.
Hi. Thank you very much for taking my call. I just want to tell Mr. Horowitz I think he's very brave to go up against the very angry left, or the wrong, as I like to call them. And please tell me if you think there is any kind of left slant in journalism and why. Thank you so much.
Right. Well, I think one scene, if one were to view this 3-hour program, we could see where the anger is coming from. And it is. The left is very angry all the time. Because of our, the journalism schools are all dominated by the left, and it's not just dominated. I'll name 3. At USC Journalism School, and these are 3 premier journalism schools in the country, or 3 of the premier. Columbia and NYU. There's not a single conservative on the journalism faculty. I once had lunch with the dean of the School of Journalism at USC, who was liberal, named Michael Parks. He was the editor-in-chief of the LA Times, decent guy, good reporter. And I said, Michael, how many conservatives do you have on your faculty? He said, none. I can't think of one, he said. I said, do you think that's a good idea from the point of view of training journalists or just from an educational point of view? He said, no, I don't. I said, what can you do about it? He said, absolutely nothing. I said, why? And I knew the answer. He says, because the faculty hires themselves. They control things.
What do you mean the faculty hires themselves?
The faculty runs the universities. This is what people have to understand. Every department is a fiefdom. The chairman appoints usually 3 professors to be on a search committee. There are usually between 100 and 500 applicants. The 3 on the search committee pick 14 for interviews. Only 3 of them ever come to the campus for an interview. So those 3 people determine the political complexion of the department, and the chairman, by determining them, determines it. And leftists do not like to have another voice in the room. The left is a totalitarian. Inside every leftist is a totalitarian. I don't care how much they say they're social democrats, how much they say they believe in democracy. When you have whole faculties, as at Columbia, my former friend Todd Gitlin is a professor there. He has never uttered a peep about the problem of having 100% from one side of the political spectrum. That is a mentality that is, what else can you call it? It's certainly not democratic. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times have over the years become as left-wing today as the Nation was in my day. They're just left-wing papers. Are there non-left-wingers on their staffs? Sure. Do they even have some editors who are non-left-wingers? Sure. But the papers are written in a partisan way. They have played a terrible role in this war. In Radical Sun, I tell the story of how, when I was an editor of Ramparts, we published classified information, which exposed the national security program.
Actually, that was happening about the same time that Ellsberg was on trial.
Exactly.
Wasn't it during the Watergate?
And we violated the espionage laws to do so. And I know that because I called the Ellsberg defense team, and Charles Nesson, who is still, and was then, is now a constitutional professor of law, advised me on how I could get away with treason, how I could get away with publishing this story and not be prosecuted. And the reason is that we live in a democracy, as he put it, and the government will have to prove that you damage national security, would have to expose so much of our national security apparatus that they won't do it. That's why there have been no prosecutions of the Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times and the leakers. The leakers who destroyed the NSA program, the surveillance program, where they were surveying telephone calls from al-Qaeda operatives abroad to people here. They destroyed the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. They destroyed a national security program which used the financial transactions in private banks to find out who the terrorists were. And I could go on. There are many other stories. They have broken the espionage laws of this country. When I did this 30 years ago, the New York Times ran a front page story providing disinformation that protected our national security. Now the Times is Ramparts. Now the New York Times is behaving the way we behaved, and I thought of myself as a Marxist revolutionary in those days, when we wanted the United States to lose the Vietnam War. The New York Times wants us to lose the Iraq War, and this is even worse than the Times coverage of the Stalin era, when they ran a propaganda operation for Stalin, denying that he had caused this famine in the Ukraine. The Times actually printed Durante's stories. He won a Pulitzer Prize for denying that there was famine. That is the Times today.
Boston.
Boston?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Hi. I'm enjoying immensely your comments, Mr. Horowitz, and I certainly would love to see you much more publicly in the news, etc. My question is, in looking at the broad picture of history, I absolutely agree with you the dangers that come from idealism and thinking that you can accomplish changing society by violent overthrow of systems. But it seems to me, in looking at history, that's come as much from the right as it has from the left. And in particular, what I'm mostly interested in hearing your comment on is today, in my thinking at least, the war in Iraq and the current policy of the last 20 years in sort of coming from a rightist conservative bent seems to be most counterproductive to the United States' own interests. And it seems to me you're in a perfect position to really stand up and counter that and get us off this wrong track and get us on a better track, because you're basically viewed as a conservative, and so you would be like one of the boys saying,
what would you have in mind?
So could you comment why you're not, I mean, it seems to me leftists in...
I believe that we have to stay in Iraq and win that war. That's what I believe. You can argue, reasonable people can disagree about the timing of the war itself, whether we should have played the game with Saddam longer than we did. So I have no problem with people who have America's interests at heart and are not on board for the war in Iraq. But I believe that we cannot afford to leave this battlefield without winning.
And you're not willing to criticize the tactics that you said earlier are mistaken?
No, I am. I would criticize the Bush administration, but not when it's now, when I have on this show. But I have to say that the Democrats, by their betrayal of this war, after all, it was Clinton who called for regime change in Iraq. The entire Clinton National Security Team supported the war in Iraq. Hillary Clinton and a majority of Democratic senators voted to authorize force. When they say they didn't know the intelligence, they are lying, lying, lying. Because the national intelligence estimates were put in their hands before the vote. Every piece of intelligence that the war was based on was open to the Democratic leadership, and they know that. And what they've done is just unforgivable. I mean, it's one thing to say, I was wrong about the war. It's another to say the president manipulated the intelligence and lied about the war, and that's why we're in it. Those are two different kinds of approaches. Sure, the right has also had messianic movements. I consider, I think anybody who looks at it will understand that fascism was created by, certainly Italian fascism was created by Mussolini, who was a disciple of Lenin and a left-winger. But it doesn't really matter, how you regard Nazism or fascism. Both of them were chiliastic, that they were messianists. They believed that you could have a world which would be a better place with a capital B and a capital P if you got rid of the Jews or whoever else they wanted to get rid of, the Gypsies and the Slavs and so forth. That puts it in a category with communism, which is the same idea. You get rid of the capitalists and everything's going to be great. Or with Ahmadinejad, who believes you get rid of the Jews and all the other infidels, especially the gays and the atheists. Look out, Noam.
We have time for one more call. Washington, D.C.
Hello, Mr. Horowitz. I just wanted to thank you for the inspiration that you've provided to college students across the nation. I've actually had personal experience with combating radical Islamists on campus, and I just think it's horrendous when different groups are allowed to promote different terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, and then people like me, we're criticized and demonized because we support the U.S. military. So I just want to thank you again for your help in that.
Where do you go to school?
UCI.
Yeah, well, we're going to have Coulter's coming there. We're going to have UCI has a Muslim student. The Muslim Students Association is created by the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and funded by the Saudis and is on the other side of the war on terror. And they're always whining. They're funded by student funds, and they try to shut down other students. They've already called Islamofascism Awareness Week Islamophobic and racist. The fact of the matter is that we're protesting the murder of 200,000 Muslims in Algeria, the execution of 4,000 Muslim gays in Iran, and so forth. Sure, there are Christian fascists, there are Jewish fascists, there are probably, well, I don't know if there can be Buddhist fascists, but maybe there are. It doesn't matter. I mean, like, people are, nutty. So, of course, Islam has fascists in it, and this fascist movement in Islam, which the Muslim Brotherhood is the fountainhead of, and the Muslim Students Association supports, is a threat to Muslims, as well as to Hindus, Christians, Jews, and atheists.
Your next project? I mean, have you thought beyond the university project?
Well, you mean in terms of active? I am an activist.
In terms of your activism. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that the war against Islamofascism is going to go on for a long time, and that's where I'm going to be, in that war on the campuses.
And your next book, again, is coming out when?
I have 2 books. One book will be out in March. It'll be called The Path to Infamy, Party of Defeat. And it's about how Democrats and radicals undermine the war on terror since 9/11. Oh, before 9/11, since then. It really goes back to Jimmy Carter and the Iranian Revolution, but through the Clinton administration and the war in Iraq. And the second book, the working title is The Decline and Fall of the Liberal Arts Curriculum, and it's about the courses in universities. So cover a couple of hundred university courses, which are pure indoctrination, and something needs to be done about that.
How long are you going to continue doing this?
Yeah, I want to get back to what I was writing about in The End of Time. Maybe we'll close the show on The End of Time. As I said, I was reading Marcus Aurelius and Dostoevsky, and I'm going to do another meditative book on the, I don't want to aggrandize it, but what Walter Isaacson called the meaning of life.
Did anybody ever tell you?
Maybe it's more the meaning of death, I don't know.
Did anybody ever tell you that this didn't sound like you, the public you?
Yeah, it's the voice that I really, it's written in an entirely different voice. And people have called it lyrical. I think that's a fairly apt description. It's a voice I'd like to do. I'm trapped in a way. I've got engaged in these. Well, you can tell. I mean, I started off the show. I've been trying to be my normal, genial self, huggable self. But then people get on that thing and start going at me, so I have to go back at them. Otherwise, they just walk all over you.
Thanks for spending the 3 hours with us.
Hey, well, thank you for having me.
That's it for In Depth for this month. Thank you for joining us, too.
For more on David Horowitz, visit the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Horowitz Freedom Center.
What happened was America got out, of course, we got out not only of Vietnam, but Indochina generally, and 2.5 million people were slaughtered by the communists to make their utopia. So what we had done had led to very bad ends. And I could go on and on. The welfare system, which was, again, something the left advocated and supported, is the worst thing that has been done, the most oppressive institution particularly for black people in this country since slavery. It destroyed the inner city black family, literally. 70% of black children had two parents in the house in 1965. 20 years later, 70% of black children were born out of wedlock. And the statistics show that if you have only one parent in the household, you're 6 times more likely to be poor. So enormous amount of black poverty, black crime, black substance abuse was created by the left. So when Peter Collier and I ceased to be leftists, it was mainly a rejection of these illusions and delusions. And we expected to become part of the American center. And lo and behold, we discovered the center wasn't there. Since we're on a book show, Peter Collier, my books used to be reviewed on the front page of the Sunday Times.
New York Times.
New York Times, which is the publication. Since we voted for Reagan, that has not only ceased to be. I don't even, my books aren't even reviewed in the Times anymore. And that was a price that we paid.
Does this look familiar?
This is the first book I ever wrote.
1962. So
in 1962, I was 23 years old. It's if a book launched, well, I want to aggrandize it that way. It's the first New Left book that anybody wrote, and it's about events in Berkeley. And I kind of backed into it. I had intended to organize 7 or 8 people to write different chapters of the book, and none of them ever did it. So I wound up each time writing the chapter.
Just to give our viewers a flavor, I want to just read a paragraph from it. Actually, this is close to the end. You say, behind every protest over the right to speak is a protest for particular speech. Only those who have something to say in the first place will risk defending the right to say it. Only those who are really concerned with society can be really concerned for freedom. The fight that the students are putting up is just the preliminary struggle. They are young and they are growing up in a world which for them is also young. For this new world, they have new ideas and new methods for putting them into practice. They have, in short, a new politics. The fight now is the fight for freedom to work it out.
Right. I was announcing the arrival of the New Left. That's basically what.
And how do you define the New Left?
Well, the New Left really, in Europe, it began in 1956. It was a reaction to the revelations about Stalin. Of course, they weren't revelations. All the anti-communists were saying that Stalin was slaughtering millions of people, and we were saying that's anti-Soviet propaganda. That's what the old left said. And then the head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a famous secret speech, which the Israelis liberated so that it appeared on the front page of the New York Times. It was called the Khrushchev Report. And it was about the crimes of Stalin. Of course, Khrushchev was only concerned about the communists that Stalin killed. He killed a lot of other people as well. So the New Left was an attempt by us. My parents were communists, and all the founders of the New Left came out of the communist left. Our idea was to escape from the taint of Stalinism, and to give us some credit, we didn't want to repeat the mistakes. What happened in the 60s was, after this kind of new beginning, by the end of the 60s, the left was once again supporting communist murderers, whether the Chinese or the Vietnamese communists or the Cambodian communist Pol Pot. So there really can't be a new left. There's only the left, and that's involved. It is and I've come to see it as a crypto religion. It believes that it can create a heaven on earth. And since human beings are really not built psychologically, they're poor people and so forth. So every experience I had, when the Rosenbergs were executed, it was a horrifying experience for me. I was there on 17th Street with whatever it was, 10,000 people when they were sent to the
How old were you?
Electric chair.
About.
I would have been 14, and I will never forget the wail when you have 10,000 people and you hear these wails. But of course, the Rosenbergs were guilty. So my formative experiences was inside the mythology of the progressive movement.
Now, throughout your life, you have written a lot of books about policy and your thoughts on politics, but you have also co-written 3 huge biographies, family biographies. One on the Rockefellers in 1976, one on the Kennedys in 85, and one on the Fords in 87. How does this fit in?
Well, and I've written 2 autobiographical, actually 3 if you include Uncivil Wars, autobiographical books. Peter Collier was my co-editor at Ramparts, and he was, Peter's a literary person. The Forsyth Saga was was the first big miniseries, which was novels by John Galsworthy. And Peter got this idea to do a generational biography of a great American family, modeled on that. And I had written a famous memo at Ramparts about the Rockefellers. I mean, I was a very studious Marxist, and I had, done one of these, it's the power structure and how they control this and that. So I think Peter felt that I would be complimentary. I would provide knowledge that he needed. In the course of that book and the others that I've written with him, I learned how to write. I learned how to do narrative. I had been very theoretical, and so I enjoy it. I put it to use in doing my own autobiography, my own biography.
I want to ask you about a couple things
Sure.
about the Kennedy biography, because you mentioned a very famous historian in here and your interaction with her, or maybe it was her husband, Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Yes.
What happened between you and Doris Kearns Goodwin's husband in writing this book?
Well, I don't remember the exact detail, but Doris is a really nice person, and I had been to see her and interview her, and but I got a midnight phone call at one point because we were doing competing books on the Kennedys, and in this business, when you're, the goal is to be a bestseller, so that you have to be there first. It doesn't matter whether you've written the better book. If you're not there first, you're not going to get the audience. So he called me, and it's an unpleasant sort of little story. Anyway, he wanted me to stop doing the Kennedy book, or he said, or I'll have to write Doris's book, something ridiculous like that.
You'd have to write Doris's book?
Yeah, that was it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to give up. He was writing some play on. Right. It was a bizarre phone call. But not one of the high points of the book. It was just a little anecdote.
But you also just talk about the fact that you had difficulties with access in writing the Kennedy book that she would not have had.
Oh, a huge. Let me just say about the Kennedy book. It's been very gratifying to get. I believe we got a letter from Evan Thomas, who knew Jack Kennedy, and who said, "This is the Jack Kennedy I knew," because neither Peter nor I had ever met Jack Kennedy. These are not political books. The most political one is the Rockefellers, and it's marred by our sort of new left politics at the end. We didn't do justice to Nelson Rockefeller because of our politics. But these other books, the one we did on the Kennedys, we did another one on the Fords, are not political books. They're biographies. This Ford book is probably the best, although the Kennedy is really, people love that book as a read.
You went after the Kennedy book, and I don't...
Oh, but you asked me about the Kennedys, yeah. Of all the books we did, The Rockefellers led us into their archive.
Mm-hmm.
The Kennedys were the hardest. People were afraid. They bullwhipped their own members. It was a terrible organization. I had to ask myself after Betty was murdered, if I wanted to do something for real people, why did I go to the Black Panther Party? I could have gone to a local black church and done the same thing. And I came to the conclusion that I did it because the Panthers were going to make a revolution, because of all the grandiose fantasies that drive people on, like me, who are, consider themselves progressives and leftists. And so I got myself involved with murderers, is what happened. And one of the things about this book, Radical Son, I say in the preface that the people who I really wrote it for, which are young, idealistic progressives like myself, will never read it. And the prediction is proved pretty much true. And that's because the left, which is very, very powerful in the media world, and of course in the universities, has so distorted who I am and what I have to say that these younger generations, particularly if they're in the left, I'm tainted in the way that Whittaker Chambers was. I can remember, one of the things actually I describe in this book is when I eventually became a conservative, which is many, many years after Betty's murder. What the murder of Betty Van Patter did was to stop me and say, you can't go on recruiting people to this cause without understanding what you've done, who they are, and you have to think about this. And I spent about 10 years in which I did no political work. But one of the revelations, Betty disappeared in December of '74. I cast my first vote for a Republican in 1984 for Ronald Reagan.
You said you'd voted for Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, but I voted for Jimmy Carter because people came to I remember election day, they say the election's going to be really close. I lived in Berkeley, of course. Election's going to be really close, David. You've got to vote, and I'm operated on that thing that one vote counts, even though, of course, it doesn't. So I had no idea who Jimmy Carter was actually at that point. Because I spent about many years in what I would call a clinical depression after Betty's death, and I really wasn't paying attention to politics. But for the sake of my radical community, which I still was sort of part of, I cast a vote for Jimmy Carter. But it was 1984 that I first voted willfully for a Republican, Ronald Reagan.
You say in your memoir, I'm sorry,
I just want to say the part of this book is the revelation that conservatives weren't the racist, sexist, oppressive devils that the left says. In fact, the conservative community is much richer in its diversity of opinions than the left was. Anyway.
When you write about this movement under your chapter Second Thoughts, you wrote, in truth, neither of us, and I think you're talking about you and your friend Peter Collier, who we'll talk about later, neither of us had systematically thought our way to a conservative position. Our attitude was more a rejection of the postures that we had taken in the past that had proven so empty and destructive.
Right. Exactly. I saw where our left-wing passions, our progressive ideals had led us. One was to lionize and make a central group out of the Black Panthers, an urban street gang that killed a lot of people. SDS had called the Panthers the vanguard of the revolution. I'm talking about the whole left was behind the Panthers. Another thing we did was to do everything we could to make America lose the war in Vietnam and get out, whatever the consequences. And of course, our opponents, Nixon, said that if we just got out abruptly, there would be a bloodbath. That was the term. And we said, no, the Vietnamese will be liberated and they'll have their own self-determination.
Today's leading conservative authors. Join us as In Depth welcomes David Horowitz, founder of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and editor-in-chief of FrontPageMag.com. Mr. Horowitz's books include Radical Son, Hating Whitey, and Unholy Alliance. He's most recently the author of Indoctrination U, The Left's War Against Academic Freedom.
Horowitz, who was Betty Van Patter?
Betty Van Patter worked for me at Ramparts. I was in the late 60s and early 70s, the editor with Peter Collier of the largest magazine of the left, Ramparts. And I got engaged in helping the Black Panther Party and raised a lot of money to buy a church in East Oakland, which was turned into a school. I called it the Oakland Community Learning Center. And Betty Van Patter was my bookkeeper at Ramparts, and I hired her, I recruited her to do the books for this school. And eventually she was doing the economy, as it were, of the party, the Black Panther Party. In December 1974, Betty Van Patter disappeared. And by the time the police fished her body out of San Francisco Bay 5 weeks later, I had figured out that the Panthers had murdered her. And that was really the end of my career in the left. The murder of Betty Van Patter, the way in which the progressive movement defended the Panthers and covered up their crimes and supported them. The fact that I had to live in fear for many years because the Panthers were, not only were they operative then, but the people, some of the people involved in the murder of Betty Van Patter, or whom I have concluded were involved in the murder, tour American campuses today, get big speaking fees, and continue their attacks on America.
By that time, how long had you been working with the Panthers?
I had been involved for a year or two. I was introduced to Huey Newton by a Hollywood producer. I tried to help their community projects is basically what I did.
From your memoir, Radical Son, about that period, you wrote this: having Huey's ear made me feel politically powerful in a new way. I had no illusion about the Panthers' role as a revolutionary vanguard. I had become involved with them out of a sense of the exhaustion of the movement and with the idea of doing something of immediate benefit for people in the community. I was tired of pouring energy into grand abstractions like the revolution and longed to see my efforts lead to practical results. However, for the political intellectual like myself, there was a seductive aspect to a partnership with Newton, even in so modest an enterprise that was also grandiose.
Exactly. I mean, the left is, as I also say in this autobiography I wrote, intoxicated with its own virtue. Only the left cares about poor people, only the left cares about black people, only the left is concerned about wars and wants to end them, and pays very little attention to the actual impact of its programs on people. It doesn't weigh the positives versus the negatives. It doesn't see concrete reality. And I watched in the 60s, I was part of the 60s, the movement gin itself up for revolution. And of course the Weather Underground blew up bathrooms in the Pentagon and the Capitol. Which exhausted itself. I mean, the movement actually died around 1969, 1970 because they had escalated their attacks and their posturing to a point where there was nothing more to do unless you were prepared to take up, AK-47s in American cities. And actually, Tom Hayden and others advocated that, but they didn't have any followers. So I said I wanted to do something concrete. Here was a school. Here they had a lot of kids. The Panther Party, maybe there were 100 children, and I wanted to raise money for this and create a school. But looking back, after I realized that the Panthers were murderers, I mean, they were gangsters, to live in a world where there's no racism, no sexism, no homophobia, no war, no poverty, because these are reflections of who we are, you have to kill a lot of people to bring them in line for your program. And so every Marxist state has been a totalitarian dictatorship and has killed lots and lots of people. And the second half of my life is trying to alert people to that danger.
Tell me more about your parents.
My parents were school teachers. My father came here when he was 1 from Russia after the pogroms that followed the Russian Revolution of 1905, I should say. They were school teachers. They were members of the party. Very decent people in their lives.
Which of them had more influence on you?
Very law-abiding. That is a question I don't even know that I can resolve. My mother had a huge. My mother was the stronger parent in the family, and encouraged me. Probably, it's probably responsible for the grandiose dreams. It was Freud who said that a son secure in his mother's love is a world conqueror forever. Whatever. But as anybody who's read Radical Son will know, there's a huge dialogue with my father. My father was very depressed, very negative person. And a lot of my life struggle, the way I see it, was not to be defeated the way he was.
What happened to him as a teacher?
My father was a member of the Communist Party, and this was in the McCarthy era. And the Communist Party was an international conspiracy. It was orchestrated from Moscow. All the things that the anti-communists said pretty much were true. But my father was just a teacher. And New York had a law called the Feinberg Law, which said you couldn't be a member of the Communist Party and teach. And he refused to answer when he was asked whether he was a member of the Communist Party, because he would have had to say he was, and then he couldn't teach. And by not saying that he was, he also couldn't teach. The history of this, that is vanished because the left writes the history and is teaching it in the schools, is that the reason that my father couldn't get away with lying or just not answering is because there was a woman named Bella Dodd who was a devout Catholic and a devout communist and was the party's liaison with the state legislature. She was very important. And the party told her she had to give up her Catholicism, and she didn't want to do that. So they had a trial of her. I mean, these are the shadow trials that took place during the McCarthy era, and purged her from the party and said terrible things about her. And for her revenge, she revealed the names of people like my father, all the party people. That is a really interesting story that can't be done in a Hollywood that has run, I don't know, whether it's 5 or 10 films taking the communist point of view in the McCarthy era. There's an interesting point of view that's neither the communist point of view nor the McCarthy committee point of view, but it has yet to be traumatized.
What would have been some of the experiences for you as a young boy that would have cemented the communist in you?
Well, in Radical Son, I describe it almost as a process of osmosis. I mean, I went to a summer camp run by the Communist Party. My hero was Paul Robeson or Howard Fast. I went to these meetings where there were these fiery speeches. I had in my life, I mean, I followed the cases of the Martinsville Seven or the Willie McGee, the Scottsboro Boys, all the, these were all cases against blacks who were accused, whether falsely or not, of crimes. In some cases that crime was committed, but Willie McGee, it was executed for rape. No white person was executed for rape then. So my life was filled from the time I was very young with championing causes that appeared to be championing black people in particular.